Most people have heard the name Sun Tzu. Few have actually read him, and even fewer have understood what he was really saying. Sun Tzu was a Chinese military general, strategist, and philosopher who lived roughly around 500 BC, during a period of relentless warfare known as the Spring and Autumn period. China wasn't one unified empire back then. It was a collection of rival states, constantly at each other's throats. War wasn't an event, it was the environment. And in that environment, Sun Tzu didn't just survive, he dominated. He served as a military commander under King Helu of the state of Wu, and under his strategic direction, Wu, a relatively smaller, less powerful state, defeated far larger and stronger enemies, not through brute force, not through sheer numbers, but through strategy, through calculation, through an almost surgical understanding of conflict itself. And then he wrote it all down. His book, The Art of War, is 13 chapters long. It's not a thick, sprawling volume. It's dense, compact. Every line carries weight. He covers everything: planning, terrain, the use of spies, the role of deception, how to manage troops, when to fight, and more importantly, when not to. It's not a book about glorifying war. It's a book about winning, and winning efficiently, with the least amount of destruction possible. Here's what makes it remarkable. It was written over 2,000 years ago, but it's still studied today, not just by military leaders, but by CEOs, athletes, lawyers, negotiators, anyone operating in a competitive space. Because what Sun Tzu laid out wasn't just about armies on a battlefield, it was about conflict in its purest form. The principles he outlined are universal. They apply anywhere two opposing forces meet. So this isn't just a history lesson. What we're going to break down are the core strategies Sun Tzu argued were essential to winning in war and competition and life. Straight from the text. No fluff, no filler. Just what he said, and why it still matters. There's one line from The Art of War that almost everyone knows. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. It's Sun Tzu's most quoted statement, and most misunderstood. People treat it like a proverb, something wise-sounding to hang on a wall. But Sun Tzu didn't write it for decoration. He wrote it as the bedrock of his entire philosophy on warfare. Without this, nothing else in the book works. So what does he actually mean? Sun Tzu argues that victory is not decided in the moment of conflict. It's decided long before that, in the quality of your knowledge. And he breaks it down with brutal clarity. Know yourself and know your enemy. You win. Know yourself but not your enemy. You win some, you lose some. Know neither, you lose. Every time. That's not poetry. That's a formula. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. And here's what most people miss. Sun Tzu places knowing yourself on equal footing with knowing your enemy. Not above it, not below it. Equal. Because one without the other is incomplete. He warns that self-ignorance is just as dangerous as ignorance of your opponent, maybe more so. Because when you don't know your own weaknesses, you walk into fights you have no business being in. You overcommit, you overextend. You mistake confidence for capability. And that's where defeat lives. Not in the strength of the enemy, but in the blindness of the self. Sun Tzu points out that most losses don't come from being outmatched. They come from being out-prepared. A general who doesn't understand his own army, its morale, its limits, its supply lines, its breaking point, is already fighting at a disadvantage before the enemy even shows up. But the other half matters just as much, knowing the enemy. And Sun Tzu isn't talking about surface-level awareness here. He's talking about deep, structural understanding. What does your opponent want? What are they afraid of? Where are they strong? And more importantly, where do they think they're strong but actually aren't? What patterns do they follow? What assumptions do they rely on? He argues that when you truly understand your enemy, you can predict them. And when you can predict them, you can control the engagement. You choose when, you choose where, you choose how. That's not reacting to a situation, that's dictating it. And this is where Sun Tzu separates himself from every other military thinker of his era. He doesn't glorify brute force. He doesn't celebrate the warrior who charges in head first. He respects the commander who wins because he understood the situation so completely that the outcome was inevitable before the first move was ever made. That's the real meaning behind this principle. It's not about gathering information for the sake of it. It's about creating certainty in an uncertain environment. Sun Tzu sees knowledge as the ultimate weapon, not swords, not numbers, not even terrain. Knowledge. And he's ruthless about what happens when you lack it. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't say, well, you might still have a chance. He says, you will face peril in every single battle, no exceptions. So the question isn't whether you're strong enough to win. The question Sun Tzu is really asking is, do you actually understand what you're walking into? Do you understand what you're working with? Because if the answer to either one is no, it doesn't matter how brave you are. It doesn't matter how many resources you have. You've already lost. Sun Tzu opens with a line that most people quote, but very few actually understand. All warfare is based on deception. It sounds simple, almost too simple, but this isn't some throwaway phrase. It's the foundation of everything he teaches, and if you miss this, you miss the entire book. See, most people think winning a battle comes down to strength, more soldiers, more weapons, more resources. Sun Tzu disagrees. He argues that the greatest advantage you can ever have isn't power, it's the ability to control what your opponent believes. Because a person who doesn't know your true position can't fight you effectively. They're swinging at shadows. And he gets specific about this. He lays out a set of principles that are almost unsettling in how calculated they are. When you are able, he says, appear unable. When you are active, appear inactive. When you are near, make the enemy believe you are far away. When you are far, make them think you are close. Every single move is designed to distort reality in your opponent's mind. That's not cowardice. That's not dishonesty for the sake of it. Sun Tzu treats deception as a tool of survival. He points out that war is a matter of life and death, the road to safety or ruin. And in something that serious, ego has no place. You don't announce your plans, you don't reveal your hand, you don't show up exactly where you're expected. Because the moment your enemy reads you clearly, you've already lost the advantage. And here's what makes this so effective. Deception doesn't just confuse the enemy, it creates hesitation. Sun Tzu understood that a confused opponent is a slow opponent, and a slow opponent makes mistakes. He warns that when you offer bait, the enemy will bite, not because they're stupid, but because they're acting on information that you planted. You shaped their reality, so now their decisions are based on a world that doesn't actually exist. Think about how dangerous that is. Your enemy is making rational choices, logical decisions, but they're operating inside a framework that you built. And every logical step they take moves them further from the truth and closer to the trap. Sun Tzu also makes a point that's easy to overlook. He says if your opponent is temperamental, irritate him. If he's arrogant, feed his ego. If he's cautious, pressure him into rash action. He's not just talking about hiding information. He's talking about manipulating behavior. You're not only lying about where you are or what you have, You're provoking specific emotional responses that lead your enemy into making the exact move you want them to make. That's a level of control most people don't even consider. And Sun Tzu doesn't present it as optional. He treats it as essential. He argues that the commander who masters deception before the battle even begins has already tilted the outcome in his favor. The fight itself is just the final act. So the takeaway here isn't be sneaky. It's much bigger than that. Sun Tzu is saying, don't play the game your enemy expects you to play. Control the narrative, control perception, and once you control what they see, you control what they do. That's what makes deception, in his framework, not just a tactic, it's the single most important principle of conflict. Everything else, positioning, timing, force, all of it works better when the enemy doesn't see it coming, and that's by design. Most people read Sun Tzu and walk away thinking the art of war is about combat, about tactics, about how to crush your enemy on the battlefield. They miss the entire point. Sun Tzu's most radical idea, the one that separates him from every other military thinker in history, is this: the greatest victory is the one that never requires a battle at all. He says it plainly. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, not to win the fight, to make the fight unnecessary. And that's where most people get confused. They think winning without fighting means being passive, avoiding conflict, rolling over. It's the exact opposite. Sun Tzu argues that winning without fighting demands more skill, more intelligence, more strategic depth than any battlefield engagement ever could. Anyone can throw a punch, but to maneuver yourself into a position where your opponent concedes before a single blow is thrown, that takes mastery. He breaks it down in a clear hierarchy. The highest form of strategy is to attack the enemy's plans, to disrupt their thinking before it even shakes shape. The next best is to disrupt their alliances, isolate them, strip away their support. After that comes attacking their army. And the worst option? Laying siege to a walled city. Direct, prolonged, grinding conflict. Sun Tzu warns that siege warfare, the most brutal, resource-draining form of engagement, is not a display of strength. It's a sign of failure. It means you've exhausted every smarter option. Or worse, you never even considered them. And this is where most leaders go wrong. They default to force. They rush into confrontation because it feels decisive, it feels bold. But Sun Tzu argues that's not boldness, that's impatience disguised as action. And impatience in war gets people killed. Real leadership, in his framework, is about making the right move before things escalate. It's about reading the landscape so clearly that you can shape the outcome without ever needing to draw your sword. The battle is won or lost long before anyone steps onto the field. He points out that every battle carries a cost, every single one, even the ones you win. Lives lost, resources burned, morale drained, time gone. A commander who wins 100 battles might look impressive on the surface, but Sun Tzu says that commander is not supreme, not even close. The supreme commander is the one who wins without those 100 battles ever taking place. That's a hard idea to accept, especially in a culture that glorifies action and aggression. But Sun Tzu isn't interested in what looks impressive. He's interested in what actually works. And what works is leverage, positioning, intelligence, making your opponent realize before the first arrow flies that fighting you is a losing proposition. That's not cowardice. That's the highest form of strategic dominance. He also makes a critical point about preservation. War destroys. Even victory leaves wreckage behind. So the leader who can achieve his objective while keeping his own forces intact, and even keeping the enemy's resources intact, that leader has accomplished something far greater than a battlefield win. He hasn't just won, He's preserved. Strength, resources, options, all of it. Sun Tzu argues that the goal is never destruction for its own sake. The goal is to win, and if you're strategic enough, truly strategic, winning doesn't require a single drop of blood. So the question isn't, how do I win the fight? The real question, the one Sun Tzu forces you to sit with, is this: how do I make the fight irrelevant? That's the highest form of leadership. Not the general who wins wars, the one who never has to fight them. In The Art of War, Sun Tzu makes a point that sounds almost counterintuitive. He says, leave your enemy an escape route. Don't surround them completely. Don't back them into a wall. And the reason? It's not compassion. It's not kindness. It's pure, cold strategy. Sun Tzu warns that a cornered enemy is the most dangerous enemy. When someone has no way out, no option left, they stop calculating, they stop being rational, and they fight with everything they have. Not because they think they can win, but because they have nothing left to lose. And that's the worst kind of opponent. Someone with nothing to lose. He points out that desperation transforms people. A soldier who might have retreated, who might have surrendered, will now fight to the death. Not out of bravery, out of pure survival instinct. You've removed every option except one: fight until the end. So that's exactly what they'll do. Every single one of them. Think about it. An army that believes it can escape will eventually try to escape. And a retreating army? That's a defeated army. They scatter, they break formation, they lose morale, they abandon their weapons. The battle is yours, without the bloodshed of a last stand. But the moment you close that door, you've just turned a retreating force into a desperate one. You've made your own victory more expensive, more costly, more bloody. And for what? Pride? The satisfaction of total encirclement? That's ego. And Sun Tzu has no patience for ego on the battlefield. He argues that smart generals don't fight harder battles than they need to. The goal isn't to destroy, it's to win. And sometimes winning means giving your enemy a way out, because the path of retreat you offer them, that becomes the path of their defeat. But here's the part most people miss. He's not saying let them go. He's saying control where they go. There's a difference, a massive one. You leave an opening, but it's the opening you choose. You funnel them, you direct their retreat, and in doing so, you dictate the terms of their collapse. They think they're running to safety. In reality, they're running exactly where you want them. That's not mercy, that's control at the highest level. Sun Tzu also warns against pressing a desperate foe too hard, even if you have the advantage, even if you outnumber them 3-1, because numbers stop mattering when the other side has decided they'd rather die than quit. History is full of smaller forces destroying larger ones, precisely because they were cornered and had nowhere left to go. The larger force had every advantage on paper, and still lost. So what does this really come down to? It comes down to understanding human nature. Sun Tzu didn't just study war, he studied people. He understood that fear, desperation, and survival instincts are forces more powerful than any army, more powerful than any strategy. And a wise commander doesn't trigger those forces in the enemy. He channels them in a direction that serves his own victory. The lesson here is uncomfortable for those who want clean, decisive, total victories. But Sun Tzu never promised clean. He promised effective. And effective means knowing when to press forward and when to deliberately leave a door open. Not because you're generous, because you're smart. A cornered animal bites. A cornered army fights to the last man. But an army that sees a way out, they'll take it. And the moment they turn their backs and start running, the battle's already over. You didn't just beat them, you made them beat themselves. Before Sun Tzu ever commanded an army, he had to prove he wasn't just a man with theories. And the way he did it, it's one of the most ruthless demonstrations of leadership ever recorded. Here's what happened. Sun Tzu had written The Art of War. The king of Wu, King Helu, read it, was impressed, but he had a question, a fair one actually. He wanted to know if Sun Tzu could move beyond words. Could he take these principles and apply them to real people? Not soldiers, not warriors. He wanted Sun Tzu to train his concubines, 18 of them. It was a test, maybe even a joke to the king. But Sun Tzu didn't flinch. He accepted. He divided the 180 women into 2 companies. And then he did something very deliberate. He placed the king's 2 favorite concubines in charge, one leading each group. He laid out the drill commands. Simple stuff. Face left, face right, turn around. He explained it clearly, made sure every single one of them understood what each command meant. Then he gave the first command. They laughed. Now, here's where most people would get frustrated. Maybe repeat the instructions louder, maybe threaten consequences. But Sun Tzu didn't react emotionally. He responded with a principle. He said, and this is key, if the instructions are unclear, if the words are not understood, that is the fault of the general. So he took responsibility. He explained the commands again, patiently, precisely, made sure there was 0 room for confusion. Then he gave the command a second time. They laughed again. And this is the moment everything changed. Sun Tzu's response was ice cold. He said, if the instructions are clear, if the words have been explained, and the troops still do not obey, that is the fault of the officers. He ordered the 2 company leaders, the king's 2 favorite concubines, to be executed. The king panicked, sent a message down immediately, begged Sun Tzu to spare them. Said he'd seen enough, that he was convinced of Sun Tzu's ability. Sun Tzu refused. He told the king something that cuts to the very core of his philosophy on command. He said, once a general has been appointed and is in the field, there are certain orders from the sovereign that he does not have to accept, and he had them beheaded, right there. After that, the remaining concubines executed every drill flawlessly. Not a sound, not a giggle. They turned left when told to turn left. They turned right when told to turn right. They moved with precision. Sun Tzu reportedly sent word to the king that the troops were now ready and could be put to any use, even marched through fire and water. The king was shaken, but he knew what he was looking at. He appointed Sun Tzu as his general.
Now, why does this story matter? Because Sun Tzu wasn't being cruel for the sake of it. He was making a point that runs through his entire philosophy. Discipline is not optional. Authority that can be ignored isn't authority at all. And a leader who cannot enforce order, no matter how brilliant their strategy, will lose. He argues that command without consequence is just noise, and noise doesn't win battles.
This one event tells you more about Sun Tzu's approach to war than most of the chapters in his book. It's not about plans. It's not about tactics. Before any of that, there has to be order. There has to be discipline. And someone has to be willing to pay the price for it. That's where it all starts. Sun Tzu doesn't treat terrain as background. He treats it as a weapon, and that distinction matters. Most commanders look at a battlefield and see dirt, hills, rivers, obstacles to manage. Sun Tzu looks at the same ground and sees something else entirely. He sees a trap, or an advantage, or the deciding factor before a single sword is drawn. He's blunt about this. In The Art of War, he states that the natural formation of the country is the soldier's best ally, not his armor, not his numbers, the ground beneath his feet. And here's where it gets interesting. Sun Tzu doesn't just say, use terrain.
He breaks it down with surgical precision. He categorizes ground into types: accessible ground, entangling ground, temporizing ground, narrow passes, precipitous heights, positions at great distance from the enemy.
Each one demands a completely different approach. Each one can save you or destroy you, depending on whether you understand what you're standing on. Take narrow passes. Sun Tzu argues that if you get there first, you occupy them and wait. You block them. You turn geography into a wall. But if your enemy gets there before you, don't attack. Walk away. Because charging into a narrow pass that's already held isn't bravery, it's suicide.
And this is what separates Sun Tzu from most military thinkers. He's not romantic about war. He doesn't care about glory or bold charges. He cares about math. If the terrain funnels your army into a tight space where your numbers mean nothing, you've already lost. Doesn't matter if you have 10,000 men. In a narrow pass, 10,000 men fight like 50. He also makes a point about high ground that most people gloss over. Sun Tzu warns, never attack uphill. Always seek the higher position. Why? Because height gives you vision, it gives you momentum, and it drains your enemy's energy before the fight even starts. A soldier climbing a hill to reach you is exhausted, exposed, and blind to what's waiting at the top. That's not a fair fight, and Sun Tzu doesn't believe in fair fights. But here's the real trick, the one that actually destroyed entire armies. It's not just about knowing the terrain, it's about knowing it better than your enemy does. Sun Tzu argues that a general who knows the terrain but doesn't understand how to use it, both offensively and defensively, will only win half the time, and half the time isn't good enough. He pushes for something deeper, the complete integration of terrain into strategy. You don't adapt to the ground. You make the ground work for you. He points out that a skilled commander uses terrain to split the enemy apart, force them on unfamiliar ground, let them march into valleys where they can be surrounded, let them cross a river, and then strike when half their force is still on the other side. The terrain doesn't fight for you, but it can make your enemy fight against himself. And that's the part most people miss. Terrain isn't passive. In Sun Tzu's framework, it's an active element of strategy, as important as troop strength, as critical as morale. He warns that a general who ignores the ground he fights on is no different from a blind man swinging a sword. He might get lucky, but luck is not strategy. Sun Tzu puts it plainly: if you know the enemy and know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt. But if you also know heaven and earth, the weather, the terrain, the conditions, you can make your victory complete, not probable, complete. Sun Tzu makes a comparison in The Art of War that sounds simple on the surface, but it's one of the most powerful strategic concepts in the entire book. He compares the ideal military force to water, not fire, not iron, not a battering ram, water. And here's why. Sun Tzu points out that water, in its natural movement, avoids high ground and rushes toward low ground. It doesn't try to push through a mountain, it flows around it. It finds the path of least resistance, not out of weakness, but out of efficiency. It doesn't waste energy fighting the terrain. It adapts to it. And over time, it reshapes everything in its path. He argues that a great strategist operates the same way. You don't commit to one rigid plan and force it to work regardless of the circumstances. That's how armies get destroyed. That's how businesses collapse. That's how people lose, by being inflexible, by being predictable. Sun Tzu warns against this directly. He says that just as water retains no constant shape, in warfare, there are no constant conditions. The enemy changes, the terrain changes, the timing changes. Everything is in motion, and if your strategy isn't moving with it, you're already falling behind. So what does he actually prescribe? Formlessness. He argues that the highest form of strategic excellence is to have no fixed form at all. no single pattern your opponent can study, no single tactic they can prepare for. When you're formless, you become unreadable. And when you're unreadable, you become unbeatable, because your enemy can't defend against what they can't predict. But here's the part most people miss. This isn't about being chaotic. It's not about making random decisions and hoping something works. Sun Tzu is very deliberate about this. Formlessness doesn't mean having no strategy. It means your strategy is so fluid, so responsive, that it looks like you don't have one. There's a discipline underneath the adaptability, and that discipline comes from preparation, from knowing the terrain, the enemy, and yourself so thoroughly that you can shift on the spot without hesitation. He also makes another critical point tied to this idea. Water doesn't just flow around obstacles, it strikes where the ground is weakest. Sun Tzu argues that a strategist must do the same. Don't attack strength. Don't go head-to-head with a fortified position just to prove a point. Find the gap. Find the soft spot. Redirect your force to where the enemy is exposed. That's not cowardice. That's intelligence. And this is where the water analogy becomes more than a metaphor. It becomes a complete framework for action. Be fluid in your planning. Be relentless in your movement. Avoid what is strong. Strike what is weak. Never commit to a shape your opponent can contain. Sun Tzu essentially argues that rigidity is death. The general who says, "This is how we've always done it," is the general who loses. The fighter who only knows one stance gets taken apart. The competitor who refuses to evolve gets left behind every single time. The world doesn't stand still. Conditions shift, opponents adjust. And Sun Tzu's answer to all of that is brutally clear. You either move like water or you break like stone. There's no middle ground. Sun Tzu dedicates an entire chapter of the art of war to espionage. Not a passing mention, not a footnote, an entire chapter. And it's the final chapter of the book, the last thing he wants you to remember. That placement is not accidental. He argues that foreknowledge is the foundation of every successful campaign, and then he makes a statement that most people overlook. He says this foreknowledge cannot come from gods, it cannot come from spirits, it cannot come from superstition or guesswork or analogy. It can only come from people, from human intelligence, from spies. That's a remarkable position to take in ancient China, where divination and spiritual guidance were deeply embedded in military culture. Sun Tzu dismisses all of it. He's saying, stop looking to the heavens for answers. The answers are on the ground, among people, and you get them through deliberate, calculated espionage. He breaks spies down into 5 categories: local spies, people from the enemy's own territory; inward spies, officials within the enemy's ranks who can be turned; converted spies, enemy agents you've captured and flipped to work for you; doomed spies, agents you deliberately feed false information, knowing they'll be caught and that the misinformation will spread; and surviving spies, operatives who go deep into enemy territory and come back with intelligence. 5 types, each with a different function, each serving a different strategic purpose. Sun Tzu isn't just saying use spies. He's laying out an entire intelligence architecture, a system. And here's where he gets brutally pragmatic. He points out that armies cost enormous amounts of money, thousands of soldiers, supply chains stretching across vast distances, years of effort, and all of it can be won or lost based on information that a single spy provides. So he asks a devastating question. Why would any commander be too stingy, too proud, or too short-sighted to invest in intelligence? He calls it the height of inhumanity, not because of some moral argument, but because failing to use spies means sending your own soldiers into battle blind. He also warns that managing spies requires the sharpest mind in the entire operation. You can't hand this off to someone average. The commander must personally oversee intelligence efforts. Because the information that comes back is only as good as the person interpreting it. Bad analysis on good intelligence is just as dangerous as no intelligence at all. And Sun Tzu goes further. He argues that of all 5 types, the converted spy is the most valuable. Why? Because a converted enemy agent gives you 2 things at once: knowledge of the enemy's plans and the ability to feed false information back. That's not just intelligence, that's control. You're now inside the enemy's decision-making process, shaping it from within. This is Sun Tzu at his most calculated. He's not talking about honor on the battlefield. He's not talking about courage under fire. He's talking about the quiet, invisible work that happens before any of that matters, the work most people never see. And he's saying, this is where wars are actually won, not in the clash of armies, not in the dramatic final charge, but in the shadows, in the information that one side has and the other doesn't. Sun Tzu makes it plain. The general who has superior intelligence doesn't just have an advantage, he has the war. Before a single soldier moves, before a single arrow is drawn, Sun Tzu says the war is already being decided, not on the battlefield, in the temple, in the quiet, unglamorous act of calculation. He calls it temple calculations, the process of measuring every factor before committing to conflict. And he's ruthless about this. He argues that the side that calculates more wins more, the side that calculates less wins less, and the side that doesn't calculate at all, they're already defeated. That's not a metaphor. He means it literally. Sun Tzu lays out 5 fundamental factors that must be assessed before anything else. Moral law, does your cause unite your people, or are they fractured? Heaven, what are the conditions, the timing, the season? Earth, what's the terrain, what advantages does it offer? The commander, is the leader capable, disciplined, wise? And method and discipline, is the army organized? Is the chain of command clear? He doesn't rank these loosely. He treats them as a diagnostic, a checklist that determines whether you should even fight at all. And that's the part most people skip over. Sun Tzu isn't just teaching how to win wars. He's teaching when not to fight them. See, there's a bias most leaders carry, the urge to act, to move, to engage. Sun Tzu pushes back hard against that. He warns that entering battle without thorough planning isn't bravery, it's recklessness. And recklessness kills, not just the leader, but everyone who follows him. So the temple isn't about strategy in the glamorous sense, it's about honesty. Brutal, uncomfortable honesty. Can you win this? Do you have the resources? Is your leadership sound? Is the timing right? And if the answers don't line up, you don't move, period. But here's what makes Sun Tzu's approach different from just being cautious. He's not saying sit back and wait forever. He's saying do the work in the dark so you dominate in the light. Plan in the shadows. Run every scenario. Identify every weakness, yours and theirs. And only then, when the math favors you, do you strike. And he makes a sharp distinction here. He argues that many battles are lost not because the army was weak, but because the general was unprepared. The failure wasn't on the battlefield. It happened weeks, maybe months before, in a room where the hard questions weren't asked, where assumptions replaced analysis, where confidence substituted for calculation. That's a sobering thought, because it means the outcome of most conflicts is sealed long before the first move. The temple is where wars are won or lost. Everything after is just execution. Sun Tzu also emphasizes comparison. He doesn't just say know yourself, he says measure yourself against your enemy. Which ruler has the stronger moral authority? Which commander is more capable? Which army is better trained?
which side enforces discipline more effectively. He turns war into an equation, cold. Methodical, almost clinical. And the reason he does this is simple. Emotion clouds judgment. Ambition distorts reality. But numbers don't lie. Conditions don't lie. And a leader who refuses to look at those conditions honestly is building his strategy on sand. So when Sun Tzu talks about the temple, he's really talking about something deeper. He's saying victory is manufactured. It's engineered in silence. It doesn't happen by chance, and it certainly doesn't happen by hope. The general who wins makes many calculations in his temple before the battle is fought. The general who loses makes few. That's not advice, that's a verdict. Sun Tzu opens The Art of War with a statement that most people skip right past. He says, war is a matter of life and death, a road to safety or ruin, and because of that, it demands study. Not guessing, not bravado, study. And the first thing he tells you to study? 5 factors, 5 conditions that determine the outcome of every conflict before a single soldier moves, before the battle lines are drawn, before anyone even picks up a weapon. Get these 5 right, and you win. Get them wrong, and it doesn't matter how brave you are, you lose. The first factor is the moral law, or as some translations put it, the way. Sun Tzu argues that this is about alignment. Are the people aligned with their leader? Do they believe in the cause? Will they follow willingly, through danger, through hardship, through death, without hesitation and without fear of consequence? He points out that an army without moral unity is an army waiting to collapse. You can have the best strategy in the world, but if your people don't believe in what they're fighting for, none of it matters. Loyalty isn't a bonus, it's the foundation. The second factor is heaven. And no, he's not talking about divine intervention. He's talking about timing, seasons, weather, the forces that are beyond your control but absolutely within your awareness. Sun Tzu argues that a wise commander doesn't ignore these conditions, he works with them. He knows when the rain will slow his enemy, when the cold will thin their ranks, when the darkness gives him cover. Timing isn't luck, it's preparation meeting awareness. The third factor is earth, terrain, distance, the physical ground you're fighting on. Is it high or low, narrow or wide, open or confined? Sun Tzu warns that the commander who doesn't know his terrain is walking blind, and a blind commander doesn't survive long. The ground itself becomes either your greatest weapon or your worst enemy. There's no neutral territory. Every inch of it works for someone. You need to make sure it works for you. The fourth factor is the commander, leadership. And Sun Tzu is very specific about what this means. He lists 5 qualities: wisdom, sincerity, benevolence, courage, and strictness. Not just 1 or 2, all 5. He argues that a commander who is brave but not wise is reckless. One who is wise but not strict loses control. One who is strict but lacks sincerity loses trust. Leadership, in his framework, isn't a single trait. It's a balance. And that balance is rare, which is exactly why most leaders fail. The fifth factor is method and discipline, organization, structure, logistics. How the army is arranged, how supplies are managed, how roles are assigned. Sun Tzu argues that this is where wars are actually sustained. The glory belongs to the battlefield, but the victory belongs to the supply chain, to the system, to the discipline that keeps everything running when chaos hits, and chaos always hits. Now here's what makes this framework so powerful. Sun Tzu doesn't say, consider these 5 things. He says, assess them. Compare yourself to your enemy across all 5. Whoever scores higher across these factors wins. Not probably, not hopefully, wins. He calls this the art of laying plans, but it's really the art of knowing the outcome before the war even starts. And that's Sun Tzu's core argument. Victory is not decided in battle. It's decided before battle, in the planning, in the assessment, in the honest, ruthless evaluation of where you stand versus where your enemy stands. The battle is just the confirmation. So, Sun Tzu just told us, never corner your enemy. Give them a way out. Let them run. Because a desperate enemy is the most dangerous enemy. But then he turns around and says something that seems like a complete contradiction. Put yourself on death ground. Death ground. That's Sun Tzu's term for a position where there is no retreat, no fallback, no safety net. Your back is against the wall, the bridges are burned, and the only way out is through. He argues that when you place your own soldiers in this position, something shifts, something fundamental. They stop thinking about survival. They stop worrying about what happens if they lose, and they fight like they've never fought before. Wait, didn't he just say a cornered force becomes uncontrollable and dangerous? Yes, and that's exactly the point. Sun Tzu understood something most leaders don't. The same psychology that makes a cornered enemy terrifying makes a cornered ally unstoppable. Desperation isn't just a threat, it's a weapon, and the question is simple: which side gets to use it? He points out that soldiers who have a safe option will take it. That's human nature. When retreat is available, the mind gravitates toward it. Not because the soldiers are cowards, but because they're human. The moment things get hard, the moment the fight turns ugly, there's a voice in the back of every soldier's head whispering, "You could pull back, you could survive." And that whisper, it kills aggression, it kills commitment, it makes men hesitate, and hesitation on the battlefield is death. So Sun Tzu's solution is brutal. Remove the option entirely. He describes generals who marched their armies across rivers and then destroyed the boats, who burned their own supplies, who deliberately moved into positions where retreat was physically impossible, not by accident, by design. And the result? Soldiers who fought with absolute ferocity because they had to. Not out of loyalty, not out of courage, out of raw, primal necessity. When the only way to live is to win, people find a way to win. But here's what separates Sun Tzu from recklessness. He's not saying throw your forces into hopeless situations. He's not glorifying suicide missions. He's very precise about this. Death ground works when the battle is winnable. The problem isn't ability. The problem is will. And death ground solves the problem of will. He argues that most battles aren't lost because of inferior numbers or inferior weapons. They're lost because one side wanted it less. One side flinched. One side started looking for the exit before the fight was even decided. Death ground eliminates that completely. There is no exit. So every soldier, from the lowest rank to the highest, is fully in. No half measures, no divided attention, just the fight in front of them. And Sun Tzu takes it even further. He says soldiers on death ground don't need instructions. They don't need motivation. They don't need speeches. They act instinctively, cohesively, because the situation itself does what no general's words ever could. It aligns every single person toward one outcome, win or die. That's not a slogan, that's reality. And people respond to reality faster than they respond to orders. So the contradiction isn't actually a contradiction at all. It's two sides of the same insight. Human nature doesn't change based on which army you're in. Fear and desperation operate the same way everywhere. Sun Tzu simply says, Make sure that force is working for you, not against you. Use it on your enemy, and you've created a nightmare you can't control. Use it on your own people, strategically, deliberately, and you've created something unstoppable. Sun Tzu makes something very clear early in his writing. An army that isn't unified is not an army, it's a crowd, and crowds don't win wars. He argues that the foundation of every military victory, before strategy, before terrain, before weapons, is the chain of command. If the people at the top can't control the people in the middle, and the people in the middle can't direct the people at the bottom, the whole thing falls apart. Doesn't matter how large the force is, doesn't matter how well equipped they are. Without a functioning chain of command, they're just bodies on a field waiting to lose. And he's very specific about how this breaks down. Sun Tzu warns that when a sovereign interferes with the operations of his general, when he tries to micromanage from the throne, he cripples his own army. He calls this hobbling the army. And the word choice matters. He's not saying it weakens it slightly. He's saying it paralyzes it. A general who has to look over his shoulder before every decision is a general who cannot act decisively. And in war, hesitation kills. But it goes both ways. Sun Tzu also holds the general to an incredibly high standard. A general who doesn't know how to maintain discipline, who issues vague commands, who fails to organize his troops properly, that general is the reason for defeat. Not the enemy, not bad luck, the general. He points out that confusion in the ranks almost always traces back to a failure in leadership. If the soldiers don't know what to do, it's because someone above them didn't do their job. So what does a proper chain of command actually look like in Sun Tzu's framework? It starts with clarity. Every person in the hierarchy knows their role, knows what's expected, knows the consequences of failure. Sun Tzu argues that when commands are consistently enforced, when the relationship between leader and soldier is built on mutual understanding, obedience becomes automatic, not out of fear alone, but out of trust. The troops trust that the orders make sense. The general trusts that the orders will be carried out. That's the loop. And when that loop works, the army moves as one body. He also stresses something that a lot of people overlook: the role of organization and managing large numbers. Sun Tzu points out that managing a large force is really no different from managing a small one. It's a matter of structure, dividing the army into smaller, manageable units, assigning clear signals, flags, drums, banners, so that communication doesn't collapse in the chaos of battle. He understood that in the middle of a fight, no one's listening to speeches. They're responding to signals, systems, and those systems need to be drilled into the force long before the first arrow flies. And here's the part that ties it all together. Sun Tzu argues that unity of command isn't just about obedience, it's about speed. An army with a clear chain of command can react faster, can pivot, can exploit an opening the moment it appears. An army without one, they're still debating while the enemy is already moving. He saw the chain of command not as a bureaucratic structure, but as a weapon. When it works, it multiplies the strength of every soldier in the ranks. When it doesn't matter how many soldiers you have. You've already lost. The army doesn't need to agree on everything, but it needs to move as one. That's what Sun Tzu demands, and he makes no exceptions. Sun Tzu has no interest in brute force, none, and that's what makes him dangerous. Because most people, most leaders, most generals, most anyone in a position of power default to strength. They believe the bigger army wins, the stronger fighter wins, the side with more resources wins. Sun Tzu looks at that assumption and dismantles it completely. He argues that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, not through overwhelming force, not through attrition, through strategy,
through outthinking, through making the fight unnecessary before it even begins. And that's not idealism, that's cold, hard pragmatism, because fighting is expensive. Every battle, even a victory, costs you soldiers, resources, time, and momentum. Sun Tzu warns that no nation has ever benefited from prolonged warfare. Not once. Even the winner bleeds. So the real question isn't, can we win this fight? It's, do we even need to? He makes a hierarchy that most people overlook. Sun Tzu ranks the levels of military achievement, and it's telling. The highest level? Defeating the enemy's strategy, breaking their plan before they can execute it. The next level? Disrupting their alliances, isolating them, stripping away their support. After that, defeating their army in the field. And the lowest, most undesirable level? Besieging a walled city. Direct, head-on confrontation. That's the bottom of the list. The worst option. Think about that. The thing most people picture when they think of war, the grand assault, the siege, the all-out clash, Sun Tzu considers it a failure of strategy. If you've reached that point, something already went wrong. He points out that a skilled general wins battles that are easy to win, not because he avoids hard fights, but because by the time he engages, he's already tilted everything in his favor. The positioning, the timing, the information. The fight itself becomes a formality. And this is where strength becomes irrelevant. Sun Tzu argues that with the right strategy, a smaller force can defeat a larger one. He's specific about this. If you can concentrate your forces while your enemy is scattered, you create local superiority, even with fewer total numbers. You fight 10 men with 100, not because you have 100 total, but because you engineered the moment so that 100 of yours meet 10 of theirs. At the point of contact, you're overwhelming, even if, on paper, you're outnumbered. That's not strength, that's math, that's design, that's strategy. He also warns against relying on strength for another reason. It makes you predictable. A strong force tends to do the obvious thing. March forward, attack directly, overwhelm. Sun Tzu argues that predictability is a death sentence. The enemy who knows what you'll do next has already beaten you. But a strategist is formless. Like water, he says. Water finds the path of least resistance. It doesn't smash through rock, it flows around it. And eventually, it wears the rock down to nothing. Sun Tzu makes it clear, the general who relies on strength is gambling. He's betting that his force is big enough, tough enough, resilient enough to absorb whatever comes. And sometimes that bet pays off, but it's still a bet. Strategy removes the gamble. Strategy means you've already won before contact is made. You've chosen the ground, the timing, the conditions. You've dictated the terms. And the enemy? The enemy shows up to a fight that was over before it started. That's not luck. That's not even talent. That's preparation meeting precision. And according to Sun Tzu, it beats raw strength every single time. Sun Tzu makes one thing very clear in the art of war. War is deception, not just partly, not just occasionally. At its core, he states it plainly. All warfare is based on deception. And this principle, appearing weak when you're strong and strong when you're weak, is the sharpest expression of that idea. Let's start with the first half, appearing weak when you're strong. Why would anyone with an advantage want to hide it? Because Sun Tzu argues that the moment your enemy knows your true strength, they adjust, they prepare, they fortify, they avoid the fight altogether. And now your advantage is neutralized, not because you lost it, but because you revealed it. He warns that showing your full hand before the decisive moment is one of the most costly mistakes a strategist can make. Strength that is visible is strength that can be countered.
But strength that is hidden, that becomes a trap. Sun Tzu argues that the smart general lures the enemy in. He looks disorganized. He looks vulnerable. He baits the opponent into advancing, into overextending, into committing resources to a fight they think is already won. And then he strikes, full force, at the exact moment the enemy is most exposed. That's not fighting dirty. That's fighting smart. Sun Tzu doesn't care about looking impressive. He cares about winning. And winning, in his framework, means controlling what your opponent believes. Now the second half, appearing strong when you're weak. This is survival. Sun Tzu understood that there are moments in any conflict where you don't have the upper hand. Your resources are low, your position is compromised, you're outmatched. And in those moments, the worst thing you can do is let the enemy see it. He argues that when you are weak, you must project strength, not to fool yourself, but to fool your opponent. Make them hesitate, make them second-guess their advantage, make them cautious when they should be aggressive. Because hesitation from a stronger enemy buys you the one thing you need most: time. Time to regroup, time to reposition, time to find an opening. Sun Tzu points out that battles are often lost not because one side was truly weaker, but because one side believed they were weaker. Perception drives decisions, and decisions drive outcomes. So if you can manipulate what the enemy perceives, you can manipulate what they decide. And if you can manipulate what they decide, you can control the outcome of the entire engagement, even from a position of disadvantage. This is what separates Sun Tzu's thinking from the brute force school of strategy. He doesn't say, get stronger. He says, control the narrative. Make the enemy see what you want them to see, not what's actually there. And here's the deeper layer. Sun Tzu argues that deception isn't a one-time trick. It's a constant discipline. Every movement, every signal, every action your opponent can observe, all of it should be deliberate. All of it should serve a purpose. You're never just acting, you're communicating. And what you communicate should always be calculated. The general who broadcasts his strength feels powerful, but Sun Tzu would say he's reckless. The general who masks his weakness feels vulnerable, but Sun Tzu would say he's dangerous. Because in the end, the fight isn't just about what you have, it's about what the other side thinks you have. And the strategist who masters that gap between reality and perception is the one who dictates the terms of every battle. That's not a tactic, that's a philosophy. Sun Tzu makes a claim that sounds almost counterintuitive for a military strategist. He says the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, not through battle, not through bloodshed, through the collapse of their will to resist. That's not idealism, that's efficiency taken to its absolute extreme. He argues that destroying an enemy army is costly. Even when you win, you lose. Soldiers, resources, time, momentum. A victory that leaves your own forces gutted is barely a victory at all. So Sun Tzu pushes commanders to think differently. Don't aim to destroy the enemy. Aim to make the enemy destroy themselves. And how does he propose doing that? By attacking what holds them together, their morale, their cohesion, their belief that they can win. Sun Tzu points out that an army's strength isn't just physical, it's psychological. Soldiers don't fight because they're strong. They fight because they believe the fight is worth it. They believe their leader knows what he's doing. They believe they have a chance. Strip that belief away, and the strongest army becomes a crowd, disorganized, hesitant, fragile. He outlines several ways to achieve this. 1. Isolate the enemy. Cut them off from allies, from supply lines, from reinforcements. When an army feels alone, doubt creeps in fast. 2. Create confusion. Use deception, misinformation, unpredictable movements. When the enemy doesn't know what you're doing, they start second-guessing everything, and an army that second-guesses itself is already half defeated. 3. Strike where they don't expect it. Not necessarily with full force. Sometimes a small, unexpected blow to a vulnerable point does more psychological damage than a full-scale assault. But Sun Tzu goes even deeper than battlefield tactics. He argues that you should target the enemy's strategy itself. If you can disrupt their plans before those plans are executed, you've beaten them at the highest level. They haven't just lost a battle, they've lost their framework for winning. And once a commander feels like he's lost control of the situation, that nothing is going according to plan, his decisions get worse. Panic sets in. Mistakes multiply. He also warns about the role of leadership in psychological warfare. Sun Tzu says a general who is easily angered can be provoked into rash action. A general who is too compassionate can be manipulated through threats to civilians. A general who is obsessed with honor can be baited into traps. Every emotional weakness in a leader is an entry point, a crack you can exploit. And this is what makes Sun Tzu's approach so unsettling. He's not just studying armies, he's studying people. He understands that behind every formation, every strategy, every fortress wall, there's a human mind. And human minds can be broken without ever being touched. He points out that the best commanders in history didn't win because they had the largest armies. They won because they understood pressure. They knew how to apply it, gradually, relentlessly, precisely, until the enemy's will simply gave out. No dramatic final battle needed, just a slow, methodical dismantling of the opponent's confidence. Sun Tzu sees this as the highest form of warfare, not the loudest, not the most violent, the most complete. Because when you break an enemy's will, you don't just win the battle in front of you, you win every battle that would have followed it. The enemy who no longer believes he can win won't fight. And an enemy who won't fight doesn't need to be defeated. He's already done that to himself. Sun Tzu doesn't talk about timing the way most people do. He doesn't treat it as a nice to have, he treats it as a matter of survival. And he's blunt about this. Wars aren't just lost by weak armies. They're lost by armies that moved at the wrong moment. He warns that prolonged warfare drains a nation, not gradually, completely. Resources dry up, morale collapses, the economy buckles, and the longer a conflict stretches, the more vulnerable you become, not just to your current enemy, but to every other threat watching from the sidelines. That last part is critical. Sun Tzu points out that when your army is exhausted and your treasury is spent, other rivals will rise to take advantage of your weakness. You didn't just lose the war, you opened the door to a dozen new ones, and no amount of clever strategy can fix that, not at that point. So he draws a hard line. He argues that no nation has ever benefited from prolonged conflict, ever. Speed matters, decisiveness matters, and a leader who allows a war to drag on, even when he's winning, is bleeding his own empire dry. But here's where it gets more nuanced. Sun Tzu isn't saying rush in recklessly. That would contradict everything he teaches about planning. What he's saying is, once you commit, finish it. Don't linger. Don't overextend. Don't get comfortable on the battlefield. Because every day you stay, you're paying a cost that compounds. He breaks this down in very practical terms. He talks about the cost of maintaining an army in the field, the food, the equipment, the supply lines, the wear on soldiers. He argues that a smart general feeds his army off the enemy's resources. Why? Because transporting supplies over long distances weakens the state. It eats into the wealth of the people, and when the people are burdened, resentment grows. When resentment grows, the foundation cracks.
That's the chain reaction Sun Tzu is warning about. Bad timing doesn't just affect the military. It destabilizes everything behind it. The home front, the economy, the political structure. One delayed campaign can unravel an entire empire. Not because the army failed, but because the war went on one season too long. And he goes further. He argues that a skilled commander values speed over perfection. He says there's never been a case where a war was won through long delays, even if the execution was brilliant. A fast, imperfect strike beats a slow, flawless one. Because war isn't a controlled environment. Every day introduces new variables, new risks, new chances for things to fall apart. This is where Sun Tzu separates good leaders from dangerous ones. A good leader knows when to strike and when to withdraw. A dangerous leader keeps pushing, not because the situation demands it, but because his pride won't let him stop. Sun Tzu has no patience for that. He sees ego-driven decisions as a death sentence, not just for the general, but for the entire force behind him. So when he talks about timing, he's really talking about discipline. The discipline to act fast, the discipline to end things before they spiral, and most importantly, the discipline to recognize that time is never neutral. It's either working for you or against you. There's no middle ground. Bad timing doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a crisis in the moment. It feels like patience. It feels like caution. And that's exactly what makes it so lethal. Sun Tzu understood this deeply, and he warns, the general who ignores it won't just lose a battle, he'll lose everything. Sun Tzu makes something very clear. The ground you fight on is never neutral. It's either helping you or it's killing you. There's no in between. And most commanders, they don't think about terrain until they're already standing on it. By then, it's too late. Sun Tzu argues that understanding the ground beneath your feet is not optional. It's a core responsibility of leadership. He goes as far as saying that terrain is the ally of the competent commander, not a nice-to-have, an ally. He identifies 6 types of ground, each with its own rules, each demanding a different response. The first is accessible ground, open terrain. Both sides can move freely, no natural barriers, no choke points. Sun Tzu's advice here is simple. Arrive first. Occupy the high, sunlit positions before your enemy does. On accessible ground, the advantage goes to whoever sets up first, because once you hold the elevated position, you control the engagement. Your opponent has to come to you, on your terms. The second is entangling ground. This is terrain that's easy to enter, but brutal to retreat from. Sun Tzu warns, if your enemy is unprepared, you strike and win. But if you strike and don't win, you can't pull back. You're trapped. So the decision to move on entangling ground has to be final. There's no half commitment here. You go all in, or you don't go at all. The third is temporizing ground where neither side gains an advantage by moving first. Sun Tzu argues that on this terrain, your enemy might try to bait you, dangle something tempting to lure you forward. Don't take it. He says retreat instead. Draw them out. Let them abandon their position, then strike when they've overextended. Patience here isn't weakness. It's the only correct move. The fourth is narrow passes, constricted terrain, tight corridors, limited movement. Sun Tzu says if you get there first, block it, fill it with your forces and wait. But if the enemy has already occupied the pass, don't attack, not unless their position has gaps. If they're fully fortified in a narrow pass, walking in is walking into a death trap. He doesn't sugarcoat it. The fifth is precipitous heights, elevated, steep terrain. Sun Tzu's rule is the same. Occupy it first. Take the high ground. Position yourself in the sunlight where you can see everything below. But if your enemy already holds the heights, don't climb up after them. Pull back, lure them down. Fighting uphill against a fortified enemy is one of the fastest ways to lose an army.
The sixth is positions at great distance. When two armies are far apart and roughly equal in strength, Sun Tzu argues that initiating battle is a mistake. The march alone drains your forces. By the time you arrive, you're tired, stretched thin, and fighting on ground you didn't choose. He warns that forcing engagement from a position of distance with no clear advantage is a losing proposition. Now, here's the thread that runs through all six. Sun Tzu isn't just describing landscapes, he's describing decisions. Every type of ground demands a specific response, and the wrong response, even with a superior army, leads to defeat.
He points out that a general who understands these 6 terrains but fails to act on that understanding is just as doomed as one who's ignorant of them. Knowledge without action is useless. Terrain isn't background, it isn't scenery. Sun Tzu treats it as a living, active element of warfare, one that shapes outcomes just as much as the soldiers themselves. Know your ground, or the ground will bury you.
This is one of Sun Tzu's most powerful observations, and it's one that most people read, nod at, and completely fail to understand. Opportunities multiply as they are seized. On the surface, it sounds simple. Take action and more chances will come. But Sun Tzu isn't talking about some vague idea of momentum. He's making a strategic argument, a very specific one, about how victory actually works in practice. He argues that war is not a series of isolated events. It's a chain. Every move creates the conditions for the next move. Every advantage gained opens a door to another advantage. And the commander who sees this, who acts on the first opportunity without hesitation, doesn't just win one small engagement. He sets off a cascade, a sequence of gains that builds on itself, faster and faster, until the enemy can't keep up. But here's the critical part. That chain only starts if you act immediately, without overthinking, without waiting for the perfect moment. Sun Tzu warns against hesitation more than almost anything else, because hesitation doesn't just cost you one opportunity, it costs you every opportunity that would have followed. The entire chain collapses before it even begins. You don't just miss a moment, you miss a future, a whole sequence of advantages that will never exist now because you waited. And why do people wait? Sun Tzu understood this too. They wait because they want certainty. They want to know the outcome before they commit. They want a guarantee. But he points out, war doesn't offer guarantees. Neither does life. The information is always incomplete. The picture is always unclear. And the commander who waits for perfect clarity will wait forever, while the one who moves, imperfectly, aggressively, decisively, reshapes the battlefield before the enemy even understands what's happening. He's not advocating recklessness. That's important to clarify. Sun Tzu never confuses speed with stupidity. He argues for calculated aggression. You assess, you prepare, you position yourself. But once the opening appears, even a small one, you strike, hard, fast, without second guessing, because that small opening is the seed of everything that comes next. And this is where it gets interesting. Sun Tzu points out that the enemy is also watching, also waiting, also looking for opportunities. So every moment you hesitate, you're not standing still, you're falling behind. The battlefield is always shifting, always moving. And if you're not the one creating that movement, then someone else is, and it won't be in your favor. He also makes a subtler point that's easy to miss. When you seize an opportunity, you don't just gain ground, you take it from the other side. It's not neutral. Every advantage you capture is an advantage your enemy loses. So the gap between you doesn't grow by 1, it grows by 2. You move forward, they move backward. And that widening gap, that's where the multiplication happens. Because now they're reacting, now they're scrambling, now they're making mistakes. And every mistake they make is another opportunity for you. That's the chain Sun Tzu is talking about. Action creates advantage. Advantage creates pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. Mistakes create more opportunities. And it all started with one decision, the decision to move when the moment was there. Most people treat opportunities like they're rare, like they need to be waited for, hoarded, carefully evaluated from every angle before committing. Sun Tzu sees it differently. He argues that opportunities aren't rare at all. They're everywhere. But they only reveal themselves to the ones already in motion, already acting, already engaged. The first opportunity is always the hardest to see. After that, they don't stop coming, but only if you moved on the first one. Sun Tzu doesn't just talk about fighting the enemy. He talks about breaking the enemy before the fight even starts. And the tool he uses for that isn't a sword, it's deception. He states it plainly. All warfare is based on deception. That line alone tells you everything about how Sun Tzu views combat. The battle isn't won on the field, it's won in the enemy's mind. If you can control what your opponent believes about your strength, your position, your intentions, you've already tilted the outcome in your favor, and your opponent won't even know it. He lays out the framework with brutal simplicity. When you are strong, appear weak. When you are near, make the enemy believe you are far. When you are ready to strike, look like you're retreating. Sun Tzu argues that the general who masters this, who can project a false image with discipline and consistency, forces the enemy into mistakes, not through superior numbers, not through brute force, through manipulation. And this isn't about lying for the sake of it. Sun Tzu sees deception as a strategic instrument. Every false signal has a purpose. Every feint is designed to pull the enemy in a specific direction. He wants the opponent to commit, to overextend, to divide their forces, to leave a gap. And the moment that gap opens, that's when you strike with everything you have. But here's what makes Sun Tzu's approach so dangerous. He doesn't just want to trick the enemy once. He wants to own the enemy's decision-making process entirely. He argues that you should offer the enemy bait, something they want, something that looks easy. Let them take it. Let them feel clever. Because the moment they chase that bait, they've stopped thinking strategically. They're reacting. And a reactive enemy is a predictable enemy. Sun Tzu points out that the general who can make the enemy move without being moved himself holds the ultimate advantage. He controls the tempo. He chooses the time. He chooses the place. The enemy just shows up where he's told to. And then there's the other side of this. Sun Tzu warns with equal force against being deceived yourself. He stresses the importance of intelligence, knowing the enemy, knowing their habits, their tendencies, their weaknesses. He argues that the general who enters battle without understanding his opponent is gambling, and gambling is not strategy. He puts it bluntly. Know the enemy and know yourself. In 100 battles, you will never be in peril. But if you don't know the enemy and you don't know yourself, you will lose every single time. There's no middle ground in his framework. Ignorance isn't a disadvantage, it's a death sentence. So the psychology of war, in Sun Tzu's view, operates on 2 levels. First, shape what the enemy sees.
Feed them the information you want them to have. Make them confident where they should be cautious. Make them cautious where they should be aggressive. Second, never let the enemy do the same to you. Stay clear-eyed. Stay informed. Don't take anything at face value. Sun Tzu understood something that most commanders learn too late. The enemy's greatest vulnerability isn't their walls or their supply lines. It's their perception. If you can corrupt that, if you can make them see the battlefield the way you want them to see it, you don't need to outfight them. You just need to outthink them. And by the time they realize what's actually happening, it's already over. Sun Tzu makes one thing absolutely clear. All warfare is based on deception. Not strength, not courage, deception. And no strategy proves that more ruthlessly than the empty fort. The idea is simple, dangerously simple. You're weak. You're exposed. You have nothing left. And instead of running, instead of surrendering, you open the gates. You sit in plain sight. You act like you want the enemy to walk in. And they don't, because it looks like a trap. That's the power of it. The empty fort doesn't work because of what you have. It works because of what your enemy thinks you have. Sun Tzu argues that the ability to appear strong when you are weak and weak when you are strong is the foundation of all strategic deception. He warns that a competent general controls perception, not just soldiers, not just territory, perception. And this is what most people get wrong about intimidation. They think it requires actual power behind it. Sun Tzu says no. It requires belief. If your enemy believes you're dangerous, you are dangerous. If your enemy believes walking through that open gate means annihilation, then that open gate is more effective than a locked one with 10,000 men behind it. He points out that the greatest victories come from breaking the enemy's will, not their body, their mind. A general who can make the enemy hesitate, even for a moment, has already seized the advantage. And the empty fort doesn't just make the enemy hesitate, it paralyzes them because they can't figure out what's happening. And uncertainty, Sun Tzu argues, is the most destructive force on a battlefield. A confused enemy makes mistakes. A scared enemy retreats. An enemy who doesn't understand what he's facing, he defeats himself. But here's the part that makes this strategy terrifying. It requires absolute nerve. You can't flinch. You can't show a single crack of fear. Sun Tzu warns that deception only works when it's total. The moment your bluff wavers, the moment one soldier on that wall looks panicked, the illusion collapses. And then you're not a strategic genius sitting calmly above an empty fort. You're a dead man. So this isn't a strategy for the timid. Sun Tzu doesn't frame deception as a cheap trick. He frames it as the highest form of warfare. It demands more discipline, more composure, and more understanding of human psychology than any frontal assault ever could. Swinging a sword is easy. Sitting still while your enemy's entire army approaches your undefended gate, that takes something most people don't have. And that's exactly why it works, because the enemy knows it too. The enemy thinks no rational person would do this unless they had something devastating waiting inside. No one would be this calm unless they were in control. So the enemy does the math, and the math says, walk away. Sun Tzu argues that the skillful warrior puts himself beyond the possibility of defeat and then waits for an opportunity to defeat the enemy. The empty fort is that principle taken to its extreme. You have nothing, but you position yourself as if you have everything. And your enemy, with all his strength, all his numbers, all his weapons, turns around and leaves. Not because he was beaten, because he was outthought. That's what Sun Tzu means when he says the supreme excellence is breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. You don't need a stronger army, you need a stronger mind. And sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield isn't a weapon at all, it's an open gate. Most people think leadership is about authority, about giving orders, about standing at the top and making people fall in line. Sun Tzu disagrees completely. In The Art of War, he lays out 5 essential qualities of a general: wisdom, sincerity, benevolence, courage, and strictness, and the order matters. He puts wisdom first, not courage, not strength, not discipline. Wisdom. That's not an accident. Sun Tzu is making a deliberate point. A leader who is brave but foolish will get his army killed. A leader who is strict but lacks understanding will breed resentment. But a leader who is wise, he sees what others miss. He moves before others react. He wins before the battle even starts. And that's really the core of Sun Tzu's philosophy on leadership. It's not about how much power you hold. It's about how well you think, how clearly you see, how deeply you understand the situation before you commit a single resource to it. He argues that the greatest general is not the one who wins 100 battles. It's the one who wins without fighting at all. And that kind of victory doesn't come from brute force. It comes from intelligence. From reading the terrain, from understanding the enemy's weaknesses, from knowing when to move and, just as critically, when to stay still. Sun Tzu warns against leaders who act on emotion. Anger, pride, ego, these are liabilities on the battlefield. A general who attacks because he's angry isn't leading, he's reacting, and reacting is not strategy. It's surrender. Surrender of control, surrender of judgment, surrender of the very thing that makes a leader dangerous, his mind. He points out that a wise leader studies, not just the enemy, but himself. He knows his own weaknesses, he knows where his army is strong and where it's exposed, and he never, ever commits to a fight he hasn't already calculated in his head. Every engagement is measured, every risk is weighed. There's nothing reckless about how Sun Tzu envisions leadership. It's methodical, it's deliberate, it's cold in the best sense of the word. And here's what separates Sun Tzu's view from how most people think about leaders. Most people admire the bold move, the dramatic charge, the leader who takes the big risk and pulls it off. Sun Tzu doesn't. He respects the leader no one notices, the one who wins so quietly, so efficiently, that people wonder if there was even a conflict at all. That's wisdom. Not flash, not spectacle, just results. He also makes it clear that a wise leader earns loyalty, not through fear, but through competence. Soldiers follow a general they trust. And trust doesn't come from shouting louder or punishing harder. It comes from making the right calls, consistently. When a leader demonstrates that he understands the situation, that he won't throw away lives on foolish gambits, his men will follow him anywhere. Not because they have to, because they believe he'll bring them home. So when Sun Tzu puts wisdom at the top of his list, he's not being philosophical for the sake of it. He's being practical. A powerful leader without wisdom is just a man with an army and no plan, and an army with no plan is already defeated. Power fades, titles get stripped, authority can be taken away overnight. But wisdom, the ability to read situations, to outthink opponents, to make decisions grounded in clarity rather than emotion, that's what makes a leader truly dangerous. That's what makes him irreplaceable. Sun Tzu understood this over 2,000 years ago, and not much has changed since. Most people think winning means never backing down, never giving ground, never retreating. Sun Tzu disagrees. completely. He makes a point that most commanders and most people refuse to accept. Sometimes the smartest move is to lose, on purpose, not because you're weak, but because you're thinking further ahead than everyone else in the room. Sun Tzu argues that the general who knows when to fight and when not to fight will be victorious. That's not a suggestion. He treats it as a law of warfare, and it cuts against everything we're taught about strength. We're taught that retreat is failure, that giving ground means cowardice. But Sun Tzu sees it completely differently. He sees retreat as a weapon, one of the most powerful weapons a commander has. Think about it. If you fight every battle that comes your way, what happens? You burn through resources. You exhaust your troops. You expose your weaknesses to anyone watching. And eventually, you lose. Not because you weren't strong enough, but because you were too stubborn to walk away when you should have. Sun Tzu warns against this directly. He points out that if your forces are unequal, if the terrain is wrong, if the timing isn't in your favor, engaging the enemy is not bravery. It's recklessness, and recklessness doesn't win wars. It ends them, badly. So what does he recommend instead? Pull back, regroup, let the enemy overextend. Let them chase you. Let them get comfortable. Let them believe they've already won. And then, when the conditions finally shift in your favor, strike with everything you have. This is what makes Sun Tzu's thinking so dangerous. He doesn't care about looking strong. He cares about being strong. And there's a massive difference between the two. One is performance. The other is strategy. He argues that the highest form of warfare isn't the dramatic last stand. It isn't the heroic charge into impossible odds. It's the quiet withdrawal that sets up the decisive blow later. The battle you don't fight today might be the exact reason you win the war tomorrow. And here's where it gets really interesting. Sun Tzu doesn't just talk about retreating to survive. He talks about retreating to manipulate. He points out that a calculated retreat can draw the enemy into a trap. You fall back, they pursue. They get aggressive, they get greedy, and suddenly they're fighting in terrain you chose, at a time you chose, under conditions you controlled from the start. That's not losing, that's engineering a victory. But this requires something most people simply don't have: patience, ego control, the discipline to look like you're losing while knowing full well that you're not. Sun Tzu understood that the crowd will mock the general who retreats. They'll call him a coward. They'll question his judgment, his nerve, his competence. And he says, let them, because the general who retreats with a plan will outlast the general who charges forward with nothing but pride. He warns that there is no greater danger than underestimating an opponent who willingly gives ground, because that opponent isn't running, he's repositioning. He's choosing when and where the real fight happens. Sun Tzu's message here is blunt. Not every battle is yours to fight. Not every provocation demands a response. And the person who understands this, who can absorb a short-term loss for a long-term gain, that person isn't playing the same game as everyone else. They're playing a longer one, a smarter one. The retreat isn't the opposite of victory. In Sun Tzu's framework, it's often the very first move toward it. Sun Tzu doesn't believe in fair fights, and he's not shy about saying it. One of the most critical ideas in the art of war is this: every opponent, no matter how powerful, has moments of weakness, gaps, openings. And Sun Tzu argues that the entire purpose of strategy is to find those moments and strike exactly then. Not before, not after, right then. He puts it plainly: attack where the enemy is unprepared. Appear where you are not expected. That's not a suggestion. That's the foundation of his entire philosophy of warfare.
But here's what most people miss. Sun Tzu isn't just talking about physical weak points, an unguarded flank, an exposed supply line. He's talking about timing. He's talking about the moment when your opponent is mid-transition, when they're shifting formations. When they're tired, when they're overconfident, when their attention is somewhere else, that's when you move. He warns against attacking strength head-on, and he's blunt about why. It's wasteful. It's reckless. You burn through resources, you exhaust your forces, and even if you win ugly. A Pyrrhic victory. Sun Tzu has no interest in that. He wants decisive outcomes with minimal cost. So what does he recommend instead? Patience, observation, discipline. Sun Tzu argues that a great commander doesn't create chaos for the sake of it. He watches for it. He waits for the enemy to make a mistake, and enemies always make mistakes. Overextension, poor communication, internal conflict, fatigue, arrogance. These aren't rare occurrences. They're inevitable. The question is whether you're paying enough attention to notice them when they happen. And that's the hard part. Because seizing vulnerability requires restraint. It requires you to hold back when every instinct says go. Sun Tzu points out that the general who cannot wait, who lunges at the first opportunity, often walks straight into a trap. Impatience is a weakness too, and a skilled opponent will exploit it. There's a deeper layer here. Sun Tzu doesn't just say, wait for weakness. He says, create the conditions for it. Draw the enemy out. Bait them. Make them move when they don't want to. Make them react to you. Because the moment they're reacting, they're no longer in control. And the one who controls the tempo of engagement controls the outcome. He uses the analogy of water. Water doesn't force its way through rock. It flows around it. It finds the path of least resistance. And over time, it wears the rock down completely. Sun Tzu argues that strategy should work the same way. You don't smash into the strongest point. You flow toward the weakest one. And this is where most people fail. Not because they don't understand the concept, but because they lack the discipline to execute it. They see an enemy and they want to fight. Right now, head on, full force. Sun Tzu would call that stupidity dressed up as bravery. He makes a critical distinction. Courage without strategy is just recklessness. And recklessness gets people killed. The real skill, he argues, is knowing when not to fight, knowing when to wait, knowing when the moment is right, and then, only then, moving with everything you've got. No hesitation, no half measures. Full commitment at the exact moment your opponent is least prepared to handle it. That's not cowardice. That's not playing dirty. That's just winning. And Sun Tzu makes it very clear. The goal is never to fight well. The goal is to win. There's a difference. And the general who understands that difference is the one still standing when the dust settles. Most people fear chaos. They avoid it, run from it, try to keep everything stable, predictable, controlled. Sun Tzu, he sees it completely differently. He doesn't treat chaos as something to survive. He treats it as something to create, deliberately, strategically, with precision. Sun Tzu argues that disorder is not a problem, it's a weapon, and the one who wields it controls the battlefield. Here's what he means. In The Art of War, he writes, amid the turmoil and tumult of battle, there may be seeming disorder, and yet no real disorder at all. That line is critical, because what he's really saying is this: the appearance of chaos and actual chaos are two very different things, and the great commander knows how to use one while avoiding the other. He points out that you can project disorder outward, toward your enemy, while maintaining absolute discipline within your own ranks. That's the game. You're not descending into chaos yourself. You're engineering it for the other side. And why does this work? Because chaos breaks decision-making. It fractures communication. It turns coordinated forces into scattered, confused individuals, acting on instinct instead of strategy. Sun Tzu understood that a disoriented enemy doesn't need to be overpowered. They just need to be pushed, and they'll defeat themselves. He warns that order can always give birth to disorder. Courage can give birth to cowardice. Strength can give birth to weakness. It all depends on the conditions. And the skilled strategist, he's the one shaping those conditions, not reacting to them, shaping them. So how does one create chaos in the opponent? Sun Tzu lays it out. You attack what they value. You threaten what they can't afford to lose. You appear where they don't expect you. You force them to defend everywhere, which means they defend nowhere effectively. Spread them thin. Keep them guessing. Make them react to you instead of executing their own plan. The moment your enemy is reacting, they've already lost the initiative, and without initiative, they're just scrambling. That scramble, that's manufactured disorder. That's the chaos Sun Tzu is talking about. But here's the part most people miss. He's very clear. You cannot use chaos if you don't first have order within yourself. He states that the ability to create disorder in the enemy comes directly from your own discipline, your own structure, your own preparation. Without that foundation, you're not creating chaos. You're just adding to it, and then it swallows you too. Sun Tzu argues that the general who understands this dynamic, order within, disorder without, holds an almost unfair advantage, because while everyone else is trying to stabilize the situation, he's the one who destabilized it in the first place. He already knows what comes next. He's already positioned for it. There's a deeper layer here too. He suggests that chaos reveals truth. When everything is orderly, people can hide behind formations, protocols, appearances. But when disorder strikes, the cracks show, weaknesses surface. The enemy's real vulnerabilities, the ones they've been concealing, become exposed. And that's when you strike. Not before, not after, right at the moment of maximum confusion. Sun Tzu doesn't romanticize chaos. He doesn't celebrate destruction for its own sake. He sees it purely as a tool, a lever, something you pull at the right time, in the right direction, for a specific outcome. Chaos isn't the enemy. Uncontrolled chaos is. And the difference between the two, that's where battles are won. Most people think leadership is about being seen, being loud, being the one in front, giving orders, taking credit. Sun Tzu disagrees completely. He argues that the greatest commanders are often the least visible, not because they're hiding, but because they've done their work so well, so far in advance, that by the time the outcome arrives, it looks effortless. It looks like it just happened. Sun Tzu makes a point that most people miss. He says the skillful fighter wins victories that bring him neither reputation for wisdom nor credit for courage. Think about that. The best leader wins, and nobody even notices the brilliance behind it. No applause, no recognition, and that's exactly the point. Why? Because if a victory looks easy, it means the conditions were set long before the battle started. The planning was so thorough, the positioning so precise, that the result was almost inevitable. And when something looks inevitable, nobody thinks to praise the person who engineered it. That's the standard Sun Tzu holds leaders to. Not fame, not glory, effectiveness. And here's where ego becomes the problem. Sun Tzu lists 5 dangerous faults that can destroy a general. One of them, delicacy of honor. In plain terms,
an oversensitivity to reputation, to pride, to how you're perceived. He warns that a leader driven by ego can be baited, manipulated, drawn into fights they should never take, simply because their pride won't let them walk away. An ego-driven leader makes it about themselves. They need to be right. They need to look strong. They need the credit. And Sun Tzu sees this as a fatal vulnerability. Not a strength. A crack in the armor that any competent enemy will exploit. He points out that the wise general leads with restraint, calm, discipline. He says a general should be serene and inscrutable, not reactive, not emotional, not performing for an audience. The moment a leader starts making decisions to protect their image instead of their position, they've already started losing. Sun Tzu also argues that real leadership is rooted in the relationship between the general and the troops. He says, "Regard your soldiers as your children, and they will follow you into the deepest valleys." That's not sentimentality, that's strategy. When people trust their leader, when they feel genuinely cared for, they fight harder. They commit fully. Not because they're ordered to, but because they want to. And that kind of loyalty, you don't earn it by standing on a pedestal. You earn it by standing with your people. There's another layer here. Sun Tzu describes the ideal general as one who advances without seeking glory and retreats without fearing disgrace. His only concern, protecting his people and serving the mission. Not his name, not his legacy, the mission. That's invisible leadership. It's not passive, it's not weak, it's the opposite. It takes enormous discipline to do the right thing when no one will ever know you did it. To make the hard call without needing anyone to clap for you afterward. Most leaders fail not because they lack skill. They fail because they can't get out of their own way. Their ego clouds their judgment, distorts their priorities, turns strategy into spectacle. Sun Tzu saw this thousands of years ago, and his conclusion is blunt. The leader who needs to be seen is the leader who will eventually be defeated, because ego doesn't win wars. Clarity does, discipline does, and the willingness to disappear behind the mission, that's what separates a good leader from a great one. Most people think warfare is about strength, about numbers, about who hits harder. Sun Tzu disagrees completely. He argues that the mind of the general is the single most decisive factor in any conflict, not the size of the army, not the quality of the weapons, the mind, and more specifically, the emotional discipline of the person in command. Sun Tzu identifies 5 dangerous faults that can destroy a general: recklessness, cowardice, a hasty temper, a delicacy of honor that makes him vulnerable to insult, and an over-concern for his men that paralyzes his decision-making. 5 faults. And notice, not one of them is about a lack of skill. Every single one is emotional. That's the point he's making. A general doesn't lose because he's incompetent. He loses because he's compromised, emotionally compromised. And the most dangerous of these? Anger. Sun Tzu is ruthless on this subject. He warns that a ruler should never launch a war out of rage. A general should never engage in battle out of spite. Why? Because anger is temporary, but destruction is permanent. His exact logic is this: anger can revert to happiness, irritation can fade, but a nation that's been destroyed cannot be brought back. The dead cannot be restored to life. So he's not saying don't feel anger. He's saying don't let anger make your decisions. There's a difference, a critical one. The emotion itself isn't the problem. Acting on it without calculation, that's the problem. And this connects to something deeper in his philosophy. Sun Tzu describes the ideal general as calm, inscrutable, impossible to read.
He argues that a great commander maintains composure, not because he doesn't feel pressure, but because he refuses to let the enemy see it. He refuses to let it dictate his movements. This is emotional intelligence in its rawest form, not the soft, corporate version people throw around today. Sun Tzu is talking about something harder, colder, the ability to detach from your own emotional reactions in real time, and instead exploit the emotional reactions of your opponent. Because that's the other side of this. He doesn't just want you to control your emotions, he wants you to weaponize your enemy's emotions against them. He points out that a short-tempered general can be provoked into reckless action. A proud general can be baited with insults. A compassionate general can be worn down through attrition because he'll overextend himself trying to protect everyone. So the battlefield, in Sun Tzu's view, is psychological before it's physical. The general who understands himself, his triggers, his blind spots, his tendencies under stress, has already gained an advantage. And the general who understands those same things about his enemy, he's already halfway to victory. He makes this explicit. Know yourself and know your enemy, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril. But most people only quote that line. They don't sit with it. Sun Tzu isn't offering a nice proverb here. He's laying out a diagnostic framework. He's saying, before you ever step onto the field, you need an honest, unflinching audit of your own weaknesses, and you need the same level of clarity about the person standing across from you. That's uncomfortable work, because it requires a kind of honesty most people avoid. It means admitting where you're fragile, where you're predictable, where your ego gets in the way. Most people think winning means fighting. Every challenge, every confrontation, every obstacle, they want to charge straight into it, head first, full force. Sun Tzu says that's foolish. He argues that the highest form of victory isn't winning a battle, it's winning without having to fight one at all. And this is where most people get it completely wrong. They confuse activity with progress. They confuse aggression with strength. But Sun Tzu makes it painfully clear. The greatest generals in history didn't win because they fought more battles. They won because they knew which battles to avoid. And that distinction matters. See, Sun Tzu points out that every battle, even the ones you win, comes at a cost. Resources get burned, energy gets drained, people get worn down. So even when you walk away with a victory, you're walking away weaker than when you started. And if you keep doing that, fight after fight after fight, eventually there's nothing left. You've won every battle, but lost the war. He warns against this very thing. He says a leader who rushes into conflict without calculating the cost isn't brave. He's reckless. And recklessness, in Sun Tzu's world, is just a slower form of defeat. So, what does he actually recommend? Sun Tzu argues that before any engagement, a wise strategist asks one question. Do I need to fight this at all? Not can I win, not will I look strong, but is this fight necessary? Because if the same outcome can be achieved without conflict, through positioning, through patience, through strategy, then fighting is waste, pure waste. And he takes it even further. He says the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. That's not weakness, that's mastery. It means you've already won before the first move is made. You've outmaneuvered, outpositioned, made the fight irrelevant. But here's where people struggle with this idea. Because avoidance feels passive, it feels like backing down, and nobody wants to feel like they're backing down. But Sun Tzu draws a hard line between avoidance out of fear and avoidance out of intelligence. One is cowardice, the other is calculation, and the difference between the two, it's everything. He points out that a skilled commander doesn't engage when the conditions aren't right. Doesn't matter how confident he feels.
doesn't matter how much pressure there is to act. If the ground isn't favorable, if the timing isn't right, if the cost outweighs the gain, he waits, or he walks away entirely. Because discipline isn't about doing more, it's about doing what's right, at the right time. And this applies far beyond the battlefield. Every confrontation in life, business, relationships, competition, carries this same principle. Sun Tzu's argument is simple. Don't fight unless you have to. And when you do fight, make sure the conditions overwhelmingly favor you. He's not saying avoid everything. He's not saying never take risks. He's saying be ruthlessly selective. Choose your ground, choose your moment. And if neither is in your favor, don't move. Stay still. Let the other side exhaust themselves. That's the rule of avoidance. Not running from conflict, but refusing to engage in conflict that doesn't serve you. Sun Tzu argues that the leader who understands this will always outlast the one who doesn't. Because while everyone else is bleeding from battles they didn't need to fight, he's still standing, full strength, ready for the one battle that actually matters. And when that battle comes, he won't just win it, he'll dominate it. Sun Tzu says it plainly. All warfare is based on deception, not strength, not numbers, not even skill. Deception. And if that sounds uncomfortable, good. It should, because the moment you understand what he's really saying, it changes how you think about every conflict you've ever been in. He argues that when you are strong, you should appear weak. When you are near, you should appear far. When you are ready to strike, you should look like you're retreating. The entire game, in Sun Tzu's eyes, is about controlling what the other side believes, because the enemy doesn't respond to reality. He responds to what he thinks is real, and if you control that, you control him. This isn't about lying for the sake of it. Sun Tzu isn't advocating dishonesty as some kind of character trait. He's making a tactical argument. The more your opponent knows about your plans, the more he can prepare. The more he can prepare, the harder your job becomes. So why would you ever give him that advantage? Why would you ever let him see what's coming? He warns that secrecy isn't just useful, it's essential. A general who reveals his strategy before execution has already handed the enemy a weapon. It doesn't matter how brilliant the plan is. If the other side knows it's coming, it's worthless. The element of surprise isn't a bonus, it's the whole point. And Sun Tzu goes further than just keeping your mouth shut. He talks about actively creating false impressions, feigning disorder when you're organized, appearing passive when you're about to attack. Dangling bait to lure the enemy into a position where he's exposed. It's calculated misdirection. You're not just hiding your hand, you're making the enemy misread it entirely. Here's the thing most people get wrong. They think deception is something you do once, a trick, a single move. Sun Tzu doesn't see it that way. For him, deception is constant. It's woven into every phase of the campaign. Before the battle, during the battle, after the battle, the enemy should never, at any point, have a clear picture of what you're doing or why. He points out that the best victories come when the enemy doesn't even realize he's lost until it's over. He moved exactly where you wanted him to move. He committed his forces exactly where you wanted him to commit them. And by the time he sees the trap, it's already closed. That doesn't happen through raw power. It happens because you controlled the information. You shaped his decisions without him knowing. And this applies beyond the battlefield. Sun Tzu's principle here is universal. In any competitive situation, business, negotiation, rivalry, the person who shows his cards first is at a disadvantage. Not because transparency is always wrong, but because in conflict, information is currency. and you don't hand currency to someone who's trying to beat you.
Sun Tzu also makes a critical distinction. He doesn't say you should be unpredictable for its own sake. Random chaos isn't strategy. The point is controlled unpredictability. You know exactly what you're doing. Your enemy doesn't. That gap between your clarity and his confusion, that's where victory lives. So the lesson is blunt. Keep your plans dark. Let the enemy guess. Let him second guess. Let him waste time and resources preparing for something that was never coming. And while he's busy reacting to shadows, you move with precision toward the real objective. Sun Tzu understood something most people still struggle with. The war isn't won when swords clash. It's won long before that, in the silence, in the misdirection, in everything the enemy never saw coming. Here's what most people get wrong about conflict. They think victory comes from overpowering the enemy, hitting them where they're strongest, meeting force with greater force. Sun Tzu says that's the worst possible approach. He argues that the essence of warfare, the absolute core of it, is striking where the enemy is weakest, not where they expect you, not where they've prepared, not where their defenses are thick and their troops are ready. You hit the soft spot, the gap in the armor, the point they forgot to protect because they were too busy reinforcing everything else. Sun Tzu calls this the principle of attacking the vulnerable point, and he doesn't present it as one tactic among many. He treats it as the foundation of all effective strategy. Everything else builds on top of this. He puts it plainly. The skillful warrior attacks where the enemy cannot defend, and defends where the enemy cannot attack. That's not just clever positioning. That's a complete inversion of how most people think about confrontation. Most people prepare to fight the battle in front of them. Sun Tzu says don't. Find a different battle, one where the odds are already in your favor before the first move is made. And this is where his thinking gets sharp. He points out that you don't need to be stronger than your opponent overall. You just need to be stronger at the exact point of contact. Concentrate your force against their weakest spot, and even a smaller army can break a larger one. Spread your strength evenly, and even a massive army becomes vulnerable everywhere. Sun Tzu uses a specific analogy here. He compares strategy to water. Water doesn't push through rock, it flows around it. It finds the lowest ground, the path of least resistance, and it moves there naturally. He argues that warfare should work the same way. You don't smash into the enemy's strength, you flow toward their weakness. And when you find it, you pour everything into that one point. But here's what makes this principle so difficult to execute. Finding the vulnerable point requires intelligence, real intelligence, not guesswork, not assumptions. Sun Tzu warns that a general who strikes blindly, even if he strikes hard, is gambling. And gambling isn't strategy. You need to know your enemy, their supply lines, their morale, their leadership, their internal fractures, the things they think nobody sees. That's where the vulnerability lives. He also makes a point that's easy to overlook. The vulnerable point isn't always physical. It's not always a position on a map or a gap in a formation. Sometimes it's psychological. Sometimes it's a commander's temper. Sometimes it's an army's exhaustion, their homesickness, their distrust of their own leaders. Sun Tzu argues that these invisible weaknesses are often more decisive than any physical one because they can't be reinforced, they can't be fortified, and once they crack, everything collapses. So the lesson here isn't just about where to attack, it's about how to see. Sun Tzu demands that a strategist look beyond the obvious, beyond what the enemy is showing you, because what they're showing you is almost always a performance. The real vulnerability is behind the display. Hidden, guarded, and the general who finds it before the battle even begins has already won. He warns that attacking strength is the habit of the foolish. It's costly, it's slow, and it plays directly into the enemy's hands. But attacking weakness, true weakness, identified with precision and struck without hesitation, that's how wars end quickly, decisively, on your terms. That's not brutality, that's efficiency, and Sun Tzu never confuses the two. Sun Tzu never assumes you'll be the strongest force on the field, and that's what makes his work so dangerous. Most strategists write from the perspective of tower. They assume superiority. Sun Tzu doesn't. He writes for the underdog just as much as he writes for the dominant force. And his advice for facing a stronger opponent is brutally clear. Do not meet them on their terms, ever. He argues that if your enemy is stronger, you avoid direct confrontation, period. No glory charges, no brave last stands. That's not strategy, that's suicide with extra steps. Sun Tzu has zero patience for commanders who throw their forces at a superior enemy just because retreating feels dishonorable. Honor doesn't win wars, survival does. So, what does he say to do instead? First, refuse the battle your opponent wants. A stronger enemy wants a direct clash because that's where their advantage lives. Sun Tzu argues you should deny them that. Force them into a different kind of fight, one they didn't prepare for, one where their size and power become liabilities instead of assets. He points out that large armies are slow, they're expensive to maintain, they need long supply lines, they need coordination across thousands of people, and all of that creates vulnerability. A smaller, faster force can exploit those vulnerabilities in ways the larger force simply can't respond to in time. Hit and move, strike and disappear. Attack the supply line, not the army. Target morale, not manpower. Sun Tzu argues that you don't need to destroy a stronger opponent. You need to exhaust them, drain their resources, stretch their patience, make the war more expensive than it's worth. And here's the part that requires real discipline. Sun Tzu warns that when you're weaker, you must be willing to give ground. Retreat isn't failure, it's repositioning. A commander who clings to territory he can't defend is a commander who's already lost. He just doesn't know it yet. Sun Tzu says something that cuts deep. He who knows when he can fight and when he cannot fight will be victorious. That's it. That's the whole game. Knowing when the conditions favor you and only engaging when they do. A weaker force that picks its battles carefully will outlast a stronger force that fights everything. But there's another angle here that's easy to overlook. Sun Tzu argues that dealing with a stronger opponent isn't just about military tactics. It's about psychology. A stronger enemy is often arrogant. They expect to win. And that expectation is a crack you can drive a wedge into. He recommends using deception heavily against a superior force. Appear weak when you are strong. Appear disorganized when you are ready. Let them underestimate you. Let them get careless. Because the moment a stronger opponent stops respecting you as a threat, that's the moment they become vulnerable. Sun Tzu also points out something most people don't want to hear. Sometimes the right move against a stronger opponent is to not fight at all. Walk away, preserve your forces. Live to fight another day under better conditions. There's no shame in that. The shame is in wasting lives for a battle you were never going to win. And this separates the amateurs from the masters. Amateurs think strength is everything. Masters know that strength without strategy is just a bigger target. Sun Tzu argues that the greatest victories aren't won by the strongest, they're won by the smartest, the ones who refuse to play a losing game, the ones who change the game entirely. That's how you beat a stronger opponent. You don't outfight them, you outthink them. Sun Tzu makes a statement in The Art of War that catches a lot of people off guard. He says, "Regard your soldiers as your children, and they will follow you into the deepest valleys. Look on them as your own beloved sons, and they will stand by you even unto death." That's a striking thing to say in a book about war. He's not being sentimental here. He's being strategic, and that distinction matters. Sun Tzu argues that loyalty, real loyalty, the kind that holds when everything is falling apart, cannot be commanded. It has to be earned, and it's earned through genuine care. Not performance, not speeches, not rewards alone. Actual care for the people under your command. He understood something that most leaders get wrong. Fear can make people obey, but it can't make them fight. Not really. Not when the stakes are highest. Not when retreat is easier. Not when surrender is an option. In those moments, the only thing that keeps someone standing in formation is the bond they have with the person leading them. And that bond? It comes from being treated like you matter, like your life isn't just a resource to be spent. But, and this is where Sun Tzu's brilliance shows, he doesn't stop there. He immediately follows up with a warning. He says if you treat your soldiers like spoiled children, if you're indulgent without discipline, if you care for them but can't command them, then they become useless, like spoiled children, he calls them. They can't be directed, can't be deployed, can't be relied on. So it's not just about kindness. It's about the balance between care and authority, between warmth and structure. Sun Tzu is describing something very specific, a relationship where people feel valued and held accountable, where they know you'd sacrifice for them, but they also know you expect everything from them. That's a hard line to walk. Most leaders fall to one side or the other. Some lead with pure authority, cold, distant, transactional. Their people comply, but there's no real commitment. The second things go sideways, that compliance evaporates. Sun Tzu warns against this. An army that fights only out of obligation will break under pressure. Others lead with too much leniency. They want to be liked. They avoid hard decisions. They let discipline slip because enforcing it feels uncomfortable. Sun Tzu warns against this even more directly. He says that kind of leader creates an army that cannot be used. All that goodwill, wasted, because without structure, care becomes chaos. The genius of Sun Tzu's position is that he sees these two things, compassion and discipline, not as opposites, but as partners. One without the other is a liability. Together, they create something almost unbreakable. He points out that when soldiers truly believe their leader cares about them, when they've seen the evidence, not just heard the words, they'll go places no order could send them. They'll hold positions no threat could keep them in. Not because they were told to, because they chose to. And that's the real power Sun Tzu is talking about. Choice. When your people choose to follow you, not because they have to, but because they want to, you have something no strategy can defeat. Sun Tzu doesn't frame this as a nice thing to do. He frames it as a necessary thing to do. It's not about being a good person, it's about being an effective leader. The care is real, but the purpose behind it is victory. Sun Tzu lays out 5 faults that will destroy a general, not weaken him, destroy him. And what makes this list so brutal is its precision. He's not talking about vague character flaws. He's naming specific psychological vulnerabilities, and then telling you exactly how each one leads to defeat. Let's go through them. The first fault is recklessness. Sun Tzu warns that a general who is reckless can be killed, not might be, can be, because recklessness isn't bravery, it's blindness disguised as courage. The reckless general charges forward without calculation. He mistakes aggression for strategy. And a skilled opponent will use that against him. drawing him into traps, baiting him into overextension. He'll rush in where a wiser man would pause, and that rush will cost him everything. The second fault is cowardice, and Sun Tzu argues this is just as fatal, but in the opposite direction. The cowardly general can be captured. He hesitates when he should act. He retreats when he should hold. He avoids risks so completely that he becomes predictable, and predictability in conflict is a death sentence.
Because the moment your opponent knows you'll always choose the safe option, he controls you. He doesn't even need to fight you. He just needs to pressure you, and you'll fold. The third fault is a hasty temper. This one Sun Tzu treats with particular seriousness. He points out that a general with a short temper can be provoked by insults. That's it. That's the exploit. You don't need a superior army. You don't need better terrain. You just need to make him angry. Because once anger takes over, discipline disappears, planning disappears, and the general starts reacting instead of commanding. He becomes a puppet, and his enemy is pulling the strings. The fourth fault is a delicacy of honor. This is subtle and dangerous in a way most people don't expect. Sun Tzu argues that a general who is too sensitive to his reputation can be baited through shame. You question his courage publicly. You challenge his dignity. And instead of making the strategically sound decision, he makes the emotionally satisfying one, just to prove something. He fights battles he should avoid. He defends positions that don't matter, all because his ego won't let him walk away, and his enemy knows it. The fifth fault is over-concern for his men. Now, this one catches people off guard because it sounds like a virtue. Caring about your soldiers, isn't that what a good leader does? Sun Tzu doesn't deny that, but he warns that when compassion becomes excessive, it turns into a liability. The general who cannot tolerate any loss will be worn down by anxiety. He'll be paralyzed by every decision that puts his people at risk. And in conflict, every meaningful decision carries risk. So he ends up doing nothing, or doing too little, or spreading his forces too thin, trying to protect everyone and protecting no one. Here's what makes this list so devastating. None of these faults are about incompetence. Every one of them is about a strength taken too far. Courage becomes recklessness. Caution becomes cowardice. Passion becomes rage. Pride becomes vanity. And compassion becomes paralysis. Sun Tzu understood something most people don't want to accept. Your greatest qualities, unexamined, undisciplined, become your greatest weaknesses. And a smart opponent won't attack your weaknesses directly. He'll turn your strengths against you. That's the real lesson here. It's not enough to know what you're good at. You need to know where your good qualities break down, where they tip from asset to vulnerability, because your enemy is already looking for that line, and if you haven't found it first, he will. Timing. That's what separates the strategist from the gambler. Sun Tzu argues that knowing what to do is only half the equation. The other half, the half most people ignore, is knowing when to do it. And he's ruthless about this point. A brilliant move at the wrong moment isn't brilliant. It's a mistake, a costly one. He makes a critical distinction here. There's a difference between being bold and being reckless. Bold is moving with precision when the moment is right. Reckless is moving because you're impatient, because you're emotional, because the pressure to act feels unbearable. And Sun Tzu warns, most people don't lose because they made the wrong decision. They lose because they made the right decision at the wrong time. That's a hard truth to sit with. Because we're wired to act. Waiting feels like failure. Stillness feels like falling behind. But Sun Tzu flips that entirely. He argues that the ability to wait, to hold your position when everything inside you screams to move, that's not passivity, that's power. real power, the kind most people never develop because they can't tolerate the discomfort of patience. And he lays out a principle that's almost surgical in its clarity.
He says, move only when there is an advantage to be gained. If there's no advantage, stay where you are. If there's no gain, don't act. Period. No exceptions. No, well, maybe it'll work out. No hoping for the best. Either the conditions favor you or they don't. And if they don't, you wait.
But waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. Sun Tzu is very specific about this. Waiting means preparing. It means watching. It means studying the terrain, reading the opponent, gathering information, so that when the moment does arrive, and it will, you're not scrambling. You're ready. You move with speed, with force, with total clarity, no hesitation. He compares this to water. Water doesn't force its way through rock. It waits, it finds the crack, and then it moves through with unstoppable force. That's the model Sun Tzu holds up. Not brute strength, not blind aggression, but patient, calculated pressure, applied at exactly the right point, at exactly the right time. And here's what makes this so difficult in practice. The right moment rarely announces itself. It doesn't come with a signal. Sun Tzu argues that recognizing it requires deep awareness of yourself, of your opponent, of the environment. Most people miss the moment because they're too focused on their own plan, their own timeline, their own ego. They're so busy thinking about what they want to happen that they can't see what's actually happening. He points out that the great commanders of history shared one trait. They could read a situation in real time and act, or not act, based on what the moment demanded, not what they wanted, not what they'd planned for, what the situation required. That's adaptability, and Sun Tzu treats it as non-negotiable. So the calculated risk isn't really about risk at all. It's about removal of risk. It's about waiting until the odds are so heavily in your favor that the move barely feels like a gamble anymore. That's the standard Sun Tzu sets, and it's a high one. He doesn't want reckless courage. He doesn't want impulsive action. He wants cold, clear-eyed calculation. Move when the advantage is real, wait when it's not, and never, not once, let emotion make that decision for you. That's not caution. That's control. And in Sun Tzu's world, control wins wars. Here's something that sounds counterintuitive. Sun Tzu argues that weakness, real, obvious, undeniable weakness, can be one of the most powerful weapons a leader has, not in spite of what it is, because of what it is. He puts it plainly: appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak. Most people read that and think it's just about deception, about faking it, but it goes much deeper than that. Sun Tzu understood something fundamental about conflict. Strength invites opposition. The moment you look powerful, every opponent starts planning for you. They study you, they prepare, they form alliances against you. But weakness gets ignored, underestimated, dismissed. And that's where the opportunity lives. He points out that the whole art of war is based on deception. Not brute force, not raw power, deception. And the most effective form of deception isn't some elaborate scheme. It's simply letting people believe what they already want to believe. And people always want to believe that a weak opponent is no threat. So the paradox is this: the side that looks like it has nothing to lose is often the side that's most dangerous. Sun Tzu takes this even further with a concept that's brutal in its simplicity. He calls it death ground. It's the place where an army has no escape, no retreat, no option but to fight or die. And he doesn't say to avoid it. He says, sometimes you put your own troops there on purpose. Why? Because desperation transforms people. When there's no way out, soldiers don't crumble. They fight with everything they have.
every ounce of energy, every last bit of will. Sun Tzu argues that soldiers who are cornered will resist with the courage of despair. The very thing that looks like a fatal disadvantage, no exit, no safety net, becomes the source of maximum power. That's the law of paradox in action. What should destroy you is exactly what makes you unbeatable. And he doesn't stop there. Sun Tzu compares the ideal strategy to water. Water doesn't fight the terrain. It doesn't smash through rocks head-on. It flows around them, finds the gaps, settles into the lowest, weakest points, and over time, it reshapes everything. He argues that just as water retains no constant shape, in warfare, there are no constant conditions. The leader who can adapt, who can take whatever position they're in and turn it into leverage, that leader is operating at the highest level. So weakness isn't something to hide, it's something to use. Think about it from the other side. Sun Tzu warns against arrogance in the strongest terms. He says, if your opponent is of choleric temper, irritate him. If he's secure, give him no rest. If he's superior in strength, evade him. Every supposed strength has a corresponding vulnerability. The stronger someone feels, the more predictable they become. The more confident, the more careless. Strength breeds complacency. Weakness breeds innovation. That's the paradox Sun Tzu keeps circling back to. And the lesson isn't just for armies. It's a principle. Whatever you lack, whatever disadvantage you carry, it contains information. It tells you where to adapt, where to redirect, where the enemy isn't looking. Sun Tzu doesn't teach people to wish for better conditions. He teaches them to weaponize the conditions they have. The leader who only knows how to win from a position of strength is limited. The leader who knows how to win from a position of weakness, that's the one nobody sees coming. And according to Sun Tzu, the one nobody sees coming is the one who wins. Sun Tzu doesn't glamorize war. He doesn't celebrate it. In fact, one of the most striking things about the art of war is how much of it is dedicated to warning against it. Not because fighting is wrong in some moral sense, but because it's expensive, brutally, devastatingly expensive. And a leader who doesn't understand that will destroy himself long before the enemy gets the chance. He makes this argument early, and he makes it hard. When an army marches, the state bleeds. Supplies, weapons, food, transport, the costs pile up fast. And the longer the conflict drags on, the worse it gets. Sun Tzu warns that no nation has ever benefited from prolonged warfare. Not once, not ever. The army weakens, the treasury drains, the people grow restless. And while you're burning through everything you have, someone else is watching, waiting, ready to move on you the moment you're depleted. That's the trap most leaders fall into. They focus on winning the battle in front of them and forget about what comes after. Sun Tzu doesn't make that mistake. He thinks in terms of total cost, not just the cost of fighting, the cost of sustaining the fight. And if the price of victory leaves you too weak to hold what you've gained, then it wasn't a victory at all. It was a slower kind of defeat. He argues that speed is the antidote to waste. A quick, decisive campaign preserves resources. A drawn-out one devours them. And this isn't just about money or materials. It's about morale. It's about energy. The longer your forces are engaged, the duller they become. Fatigue sets in. Focus slips. What started as a sharp, motivated army turns into a tired, resentful one. Sun Tzu saw this clearly. Time is not neutral in conflict. The longer you take, the more it costs you, in every way. And here's where he gets really practical. Sun Tzu doesn't just say, be efficient. He gives a framework for it.
He talks about foraging off the enemy's land instead of hauling supplies from home. He talks about converting captured resources to your own use. One cartload of the enemy's provisions, he says, is worth 20 of your own. Because it's not just the material, it's the cost of transporting it, protecting it, replacing it. Every resource you take from the enemy is a resource you didn't have to spend. That's not just smart warfare, that's arithmetic. He also warns against the kind of leader who throws everything at a single objective without considering the bigger picture. Victory means nothing if your forces are shattered by the time you achieve it.
Sun Tzu's ideal general doesn't just win, he wins efficiently, with the minimum expenditure necessary. No wasted movement, no unnecessary destruction. Every action serves the larger strategy. And this extends to people too. Sun Tzu doesn't treat soldiers as disposable. A wise general, he argues, preserves his men.
Not out of sentimentality, out of pragmatism. Trained, experienced soldiers are a resource. Replacing them takes time and costs heavily. Spending them carelessly on poorly planned engagements is not bold leadership, it's incompetence.
So Sun Tzu's message on resource management comes down to this. War is a fire. It can be useful if it's controlled, but the moment you lose control of it, it consumes everything. Your supplies, your people, your future. The leader who wins and has nothing left hasn't won. He's just the last one standing in a wasteland. Sun Tzu understood that real victory isn't just about defeating the enemy. It's about emerging from the conflict with enough strength to actually enjoy what you've gained. Sun Tzu makes one thing absolutely clear. The rigid do not survive. The flexible do. He argues that no plan, no matter how brilliant, should be treated as permanent. The moment conditions change, the plan must change with them. A general who clings to a strategy that no longer fits the reality on the ground isn't disciplined. He's delusional, and delusion on a battlefield gets people killed. This is one of Sun Tzu's most relentless points. He compares the ideal strategist to water again. Water has no fixed shape. It adapts to whatever container holds it. It shifts with the terrain, moves with gravity, finds new paths when old ones are blocked. He argues that a great commander operates the same way. No fixed formations, no rigid doctrine, just constant, fluid adjustment based on what's actually happening, not what was supposed to happen. And that distinction matters, because most people plan for the war they want to fight, not the war they're actually in. Sun Tzu warns against this directly. He points out that the enemy has a vote, the weather has a vote, the terrain has a vote, and none of them care about your plan. So the general who builds his entire strategy around one scenario, one expected outcome, has already made himself brittle, and brittle things break. He goes further. Sun Tzu argues that the ability to adapt isn't just a useful trait, it's the single most important quality a commander can have. More important than courage, more important than strength, more important than numbers. Because a courageous general who can't adapt is just a brave man walking into a trap, and a strong army led by a rigid mind is nothing more than a large target. So, what does real adaptation look like in Sun Tzu's framework? It's not reactive panic. It's not throwing out the entire plan the moment something goes wrong. It's reading the situation, constantly, and making adjustments before the crisis hits. He draws a hard line between the general who adapts because he's paying attention and the general who scrambles because he wasn't. One is strategy, the other is desperation, and Sun Tzu has no patience for desperation. He also warns about something subtle, the danger of past success. A commander wins a battle using a particular tactic, and suddenly that tactic becomes his identity. He uses it again and again, and it works until it doesn't. Sun Tzu points out that repeating the same method is predictable, and predictability is a gift to your enemy. He argues that you should never repeat the tactics that brought you victory. Instead, shape new responses based on new circumstances. Every situation demands its own solution. Every battle is different, and the general who treats them all the same will eventually face one that destroys him. This is where Sun Tzu separates the competent from the exceptional. Competent generals follow plans well. Exceptional generals abandon plans well. They know when a strategy has expired. They don't fight for it. They don't defend it out of pride. They let it go, and they build something better in real time. He puts it bluntly, the general who cannot adapt to changing circumstances, even if he understands the principles of warfare, will fail to turn that knowledge into victory. Knowing isn't enough. Applying knowledge to a situation that's shifting under your feet, that's the real skill. Sun Tzu's message here is uncomfortable but undeniable. The world doesn't hold still for anyone. Not for the strong, not for the smart, not for the prepared. It moves, it shifts, it changes without warning. And the only ones still standing at the end are the ones who changed with it. Sun Tzu makes a statement that most people read right past without understanding it. He says, "The greatest victory is that which requires no battle." Sit with that for a second. He's not being poetic, he's being literal. Sun Tzu argues that if you have to fight at all, something already went wrong. The highest form of strategy isn't winning the battle, it's making the battle unnecessary. And when that's not possible, the next best thing is winning so decisively, so cleanly, that it barely looks like a contest. He points out that throughout history, the victories people celebrate, the dramatic comebacks, the bloody last stands, the hard-fought clashes, those aren't examples of great strategy. They're examples of poor planning that happened to work out. Sun Tzu doesn't admire them. He sees them as failures dressed up in glory. Real mastery, he argues, looks boring from the outside. The enemy folds before the first arrow is fired. The war ends before it starts. And nobody applauds because nobody realizes how much work went into making it look that easy. That's the paradox Sun Tzu identifies. The better the strategy, the less impressive it appears. Because great strategy removes the drama. It removes the uncertainty. It removes the chaos. And people don't find that exciting. They find it anticlimactic. But Sun Tzu doesn't care about excitement. He cares about outcomes. He argues that the commander who wins without fighting has done something far more difficult than the one who wins through bloodshed. He's outmaneuvered the enemy politically, economically, psychologically. He's cut off alliances, disrupted supply chains, planted doubt in the enemy's leadership, made the cost of fighting so obviously unacceptable that surrender becomes the rational choice. And here's what separates this from wishful thinking. Sun Tzu lays out how to get there. It's not magic, it's preparation, it's intelligence gathering, it's knowing the enemy so well that you can predict their moves before they make them. It's positioning your forces so perfectly that the enemy looks at the board and realizes there's no good option left. He compares it to a boulder rolling downhill. By the time it's moving, the outcome is already decided. The work was done before the motion started, choosing the right hill, positioning the boulder at the right angle, waiting for the right moment to release it. The roll itself is just the inevitable conclusion. Sun Tzu warns that commanders who rely on brute force and improvisation will win some battles, maybe even most, but they'll pay a price every single time. Casualties, resources, time, morale. And over a long campaign, those costs compound. They bleed you dry. The commander who plans so thoroughly that the fight is over before it begins, he preserves everything. And this connects to something Sun Tzu repeats throughout the entire text. War is expensive, not just in money, in lives, in stability, in political capital. Every battle you fight is a cost. So the fewer battles you need to fight, the stronger you remain. The commander who fights 100 battles and wins them all is not supreme. The commander who wins without fighting a single one, that's supremacy.
Most people won't accept this because it's not satisfying. There's no hero moment, no dramatic sword clash, no against all odds triumph, just quiet, methodical dominance. And Sun Tzu argues that's exactly the point. Strategy isn't supposed to be thrilling, it's supposed to be effective. The greatest victories don't make for great stories. They don't inspire paintings or songs. They just work, quietly, completely, and the opponent is left wondering what even happened. That's mastery, and Sun Tzu makes no apologies for how boring it looks. There's a belief that's been around forever. Bigger armies win. More resources win. More people, more weapons, more everything. That's what determines victory. Sun Tzu disagrees, sharply. He argues that speed is more dangerous than size, that a fast, decisive force will overwhelm a larger, slower one almost every time. Not because strength doesn't matter. It does, but because strength without timing is just weight, and weight, on its own, doesn't win battles. He puts it bluntly, rapidity is the essence of war. Not preparation, not accumulation, rapidity. That word choice is deliberate. He's saying the core of warfare, its very nature, is defined by how fast you move, not how much you carry. And when you think about it, the logic is airtight. A slow force gives the enemy time. Time to prepare, time to reposition, time to call for reinforcements, time to study your approach and find its weaknesses. Every hour you waste, you're handing your opponent options, and options are exactly what you don't want them to have. Sun Tzu warns against prolonged campaigns for this exact reason. He says long wars drain morale, exhaust resources, and expose your position to opportunists, enemies who weren't even part of the original conflict, but now see a chance to strike while you're stretched thin. Speed eliminates all of that. You move before the situation has time to deteriorate, before the variables multiply, before the battlefield becomes something you no longer recognize. But here's the part that separates Sun Tzu from basic military thinking. He's not just talking about moving fast physically, he's talking about deciding fast, acting fast, committing fast. The speed he's describing starts in the mind of the commander, not on the field. He points out that opportunities in war are fleeting. They open and close in moments. The general who hesitates, who waits for perfect information, who deliberates too long, who needs consensus before acting, that general will watch the moment pass, and moments, once gone, don't come back. Sun Tzu argues that a good plan executed immediately is worth more than a perfect plan executed too late. That's a hard truth for people who like certainty, who like guarantees. But war doesn't offer guarantees, and neither does life. What it offers is windows. Small, narrow, temporary windows, and speed is how you get through them. There's another layer to this. Speed doesn't just help you, it destabilizes your enemy. When you move faster than they can process, you break their decision-making cycle. They're still responding to your last move while you're already executing the next one. They fall behind, and once they're behind, they start making mistakes, rushed decisions, panicked orders, miscommunication, all because you didn't give them the luxury of time. Sun Tzu essentially turns speed into a form of psychological warfare. You're not just outrunning them, you're overwhelming their ability to think clearly.
And this is why he values timing over numbers. A small force that strikes at the right moment, when the enemy is mid-transition, when their supply lines are exposed, when their attention is elsewhere, that small force can do what a massive army couldn't do head-on. Because it's not about how hard you hit, it's about when you hit. He makes this painfully clear.
The skilled commander doesn't wait for favorable conditions. He creates them through movement, through tempo, through relentless pace. Strength is an asset, but speed is a weapon, and Sun Tzu leaves no doubt about which one he trusts more when the outcome is on the line.
Here's where Sun Tzu separates himself from every other military thinker in history. Most strategists talk about how to win battles. Sun Tzu asks a different question. Why are you fighting at all? He makes one of the boldest claims in the entire text. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Not after fighting, not through fighting, without it. And this isn't idealism. Sun Tzu is not a pacifist. He's not against violence because it's wrong. He's against it because it's expensive. He argues that every battle, even a victory, costs something. Lives, resources, time, morale. A prolonged war drains the state. It exhausts the army, and it creates openings for other threats. So even when you win on the field, you may still lose the larger game. That's the calculation he's making. Not a moral one, a strategic one. Sun Tzu lays out a clear hierarchy. The highest form of victory is to defeat the enemy's strategy, to dismantle their plan before it even takes shape. The next best is to break their alliances, to isolate them, strip away their support, leave them standing alone. After that comes defeating their army in the field. And the lowest, most costly form of victory? Sieging a fortified city, grinding it out, brute force against a prepared defense. Look at that order. The options that involve the least fighting rank highest. The option that involves the most fighting ranks dead last. That's not an accident. That's the core of his philosophy. And he's brutally specific about why sieges are the worst option. He describes the process, building shields, preparing equipment, spending months just to get into position, and then the general, unable to contain his frustration, orders his men to swarm the walls. A third of them die, and the city still doesn't fall. He calls this the disaster of siege warfare, not a setback, a disaster. So what does winning without fighting actually look like? Sun Tzu argues it's about making the enemy's position so untenable that resistance becomes pointless. You cut their supply lines. You sever their alliances. You outmaneuver them diplomatically. You present such an overwhelming strategic advantage that the rational choice, the only choice, is to yield. It's not about being passive. It's about being so far ahead that the fight becomes unnecessary. And there's a deeper layer to this. Sun Tzu points out that when you destroy an enemy's army, you inherit the wreckage. Burned cities, devastated land, a hostile population. But when you take a state intact, its infrastructure, its people, its economy, you gain something of actual value. The goal is not destruction. The goal is acquisition. And you don't acquire anything useful through demolition. This is where most people misunderstand him. They hear winning without fighting and think it means avoiding confrontation. It doesn't. It means making confrontation irrelevant. It means doing the strategic work so thoroughly, the positioning, the intelligence, the alliances, the pressure, that by the time your opponent faces you, the outcome is already decided. Sun Tzu is clear. The general who wins every battle is not the greatest commander. The general who wins without battle, that is the pinnacle of skill, because it means he understood the situation so completely, moved so precisely, and applied pressure so effectively
that fighting was never required.
That's not weakness, that's mastery, and it demands more intelligence, more patience, and more discipline than any battlefield engagement ever could, because anyone can throw a punch. But making your opponent lower his fist before it's ever raised, that takes something else entirely.
Sun Tzu doesn't sugarcoat this. He states it as fact. No nation has ever benefited from prolonged warfare. Ever. Not once in history. And he doesn't leave room for debate on it. This is one of the most overlooked principles in his entire work. People love to talk about tactics, about deception, about positioning, but Sun Tzu spends serious time on something far less glamorous: cost. The raw, grinding cost of dragging out a conflict longer than it needs to last. He argues that when a war drags on, everything deteriorates. Resources dry up, morale collapses, the economy bleeds out. And even if you eventually win, what exactly have you won? A hollowed-out victory, a kingdom standing on broken legs. Sun Tzu says that kind of win is no different from a loss, because what good is victory if you've destroyed yourself in the process of achieving it? And he's not just talking about armies. This principle cuts across everything: business, competition, personal conflicts. Any situation where you're locked in a prolonged struggle, you're losing, even if the scoreboard says otherwise. Because the longer a fight goes on, the more it takes from you. Things you can't get back: time, energy, focus, opportunity. Sun Tzu warns that a prolonged campaign dulls the blade. That's his exact metaphor. Your weapons lose their edge, your soldiers lose their fire.
And your enemies, the ones watching from the outside, the ones who haven't been fighting, they see an opening, they see weakness, and they move in. So not only are you weaker from the fight itself, you've now made yourself vulnerable to threats you weren't even thinking about. That's the trap of prolonged warfare. It narrows your vision. You become so consumed by the battle in front of you that you lose sight of everything else. And Sun Tzu says that's exactly when you're most exposed.
So what's his solution? Speed, decisiveness. Sun Tzu argues that if you must fight, fight fast. Strike hard, end it quickly, and move on. He doesn't romanticize long campaigns. He doesn't see endurance in war as a virtue. He sees it as a failure of strategy. Because if you planned correctly, if you positioned correctly, if you calculated correctly, the conflict should be short, decisive, over before the cost becomes unbearable.
He points out that a wise general wins quickly not because he's impatient, but because he understands what prolonged conflict does to everything around him: his troops, his supplies, his standing. Every day the fight continues is a day that drains something vital, and those losses compound, slowly at first, then all at once. And here's what makes this principle so brutal. Sun Tzu acknowledges that sometimes, even with the best strategy, things take longer than expected. Wars don't always follow the plan. But he says, even then, the objective must remain speed. The goal is always to resolve, to finish, to close the distance between where you are and where you need to be as fast as possible. No lingering, no drawn-out sieges, no wars of attrition where both sides bleed until one collapses first. He calls that kind of fighting wasteful, undisciplined, and ultimately self-destructive. Sun Tzu's message here is blunt: get in, achieve your objective, and get out. Don't fall in love with the fight. Don't let pride keep you in a war that's already cost too much. Because the moment a conflict starts costing more than it's worth, you've already lost, whether you realize it yet or not. That's not strategy anymore. That's stubbornness, and Sun Tzu has no patience for it.